On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines of the 1st Division landed on an obscure Pacific island called Guadalcanal. It marked the first American offensive of World War II. The campaign to secure the island lasted 6 months, and for much of its course, the balance teetered precariously from one side to the other. It included 6 major naval battles, daily aerial engagements, and countless clashes on land. No campaign in either theater saw such sustained action by sea, land, and air. In June of 1942, the United States Navy scored one of the most stunning victories of the Second World War at the Battle of Midway. The Japanese Imperial Navy, which for the 6 months after Pearl Harbor had moved at will throughout the Pacific, was resoundingly defeated by a vastly outnumbered American force. The triumph at Midway sent military planners into a flurry of activity, and a number of schemes were hatched to exploit the victory. Ultimately, it was decided that the American Navy and Marine Corps would seize and defend Tulagi and the Santa Cruz Islands, while Army forces made a parallel advance on New Guinea. Codenamed Operation Watchtower, this first offensive was ordered by the Joint Chiefs of Staff on July 2nd, 1942. The unpredictable forces of war began to link the United States with Guadalcanal in late May 1942, when advance echelons of the 1st Marine Division embarked for the South Pacific. Destination, New Zealand. Mission, undetermined. Somewhere on some unspecified battleground, sometime in the uncertain future, the untested Marines would clash with the tested soldiers of Japan. But first, the tedious ordeal of the convoy, uneventful, interminable weeks at sea.
They loaded us in San Francisco. It was probably mid or late June, aboard the Kungsholm, which was a Swedish luxury liner. And they had us stacked in there like sardines.
Ship just smelled like hell, and they were always afraid of the Japanese slant-eyed periscopes showing up someplace, so you had to be in the hold, and there was a doors shut and no lights, and 6 guys. And if the top guy got ill, then it started a kind of a chain reaction. It took 18 days, and it wasn't totally pleasant.
The ocean lifeline to the South Pacific was the war's longest and most tenuous. Stretching more than 6,500 miles from California to New Zealand, it tied Australia to the United States. If this supply line were broken, Australia and Asia would be forever Japanese. The advance echelon of the 1st Marine Division arrived at Wellington in mid-June. The Marines were to begin training for a future campaign in the Pacific and didn't expect to see any action for another 6 months. They were green, many of them fresh out of boot camp. Early in July, a lone American plane set in motion a chain of events that would bring American and Japanese forces together at a place that neither side had foreseen. On obscure Guadalcanal, air reconnaissance confirmed what radio intelligence had earlier discovered: the Japanese were building an airfield. What the plane had seen changed the course of the Pacific War. This discovery redirected Operation Watchtower from the Santa Cruz Islands to Guadalcanal and Tulagi, with the assault to take place on August 1st, less than 1 month away. The new target was prophetically codenamed Cactus. No one on either side could have predicted the grueling 6-month struggle that would ensue. Suddenly, the training program was canceled. The Marines of the 1st Division were abruptly alerted and given the mission. Objections to an August invasion by Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley and Marine General Archer Vandegrift, the local commanders, were futile. However, they did gain one concession from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The landing would be put off for 1 week to the 7th of August.
General Vandegrift's problem was that they had no hard intelligence or maps on Guadalcanal. So they did the best they could. They interviewed anyone they could find who had any knowledge or information on Guadalcanal. Plantation owners, missionaries, sea captains, anyone who could tell them anything about the island. They then used those interviews as the basis from which they formed maps and also their first operational plans.
Speed was essential. Vandegrift and his staff had only a matter of days in which to formulate their plan, toughen up the troops in final training, to stage a rehearsal of the attack, and to complete the 7-day trip to Guadalcanal. Supplies commercially loaded stateside would have to be unloaded, sorted, and combat loaded. As time grew short, the Marines were pressed into loading duties.
We were put to work loading ammo onto the, I think it was the Macaulay.
We worked 4 hours on and 4 hours off around the clock, unloading and combat loading the ships. We seemed to have everything we needed. I was just a kid, a buck private. I didn't know what was in those ships or what difference combat loading was from any other kind of loading.
There was no liberty. If you wanted liberty, you went over the side. I recall specifically, of course, I wasn't what you call a real good soldier. Going ashore, having a steak and eggs.
I just couldn't see being that far away from home and not getting to see anything. So I went over the fence a couple times to go into town and see what it was like. Unfortunately, I lucked out and didn't get caught. But it was a beautiful town, nice people.
On July 22nd, the 1st Division set sail for the Fiji Islands, where it would stage an invasion rehearsal under the scrutiny of Marine Generals Vandegrift and Rupertus and Vice Admiral Kelly Turner, who commanded the amphibious task force. Yet another convoy, but this time it was different. This convoy, loaded in gear, sailed for battle. For the first few days, the seas were placid, but this condition was not to prevail.
Between Wellington and the Fijis, as I understood it, was the roughest seas around anywhere. And I'm telling you, that was one boat ride.
The waves must have been 50 or 60 feet high. We had a little single stack destroyer that apparently carried messages around the fleet, and it came over by every day, at least once a day, and shot a line over and passed something across the line. And it came during that storm, and a wave caught it and swept it in against the side of the ship, and it bashed up one of the gun mounts on the ship, and then it slid away when the wave went back. And there was just a puff of smoke came out of that stack, and that little APD just took off like a striped ape. And I don't remember just where it was, but somewhere along the way, some more ships joined us, and there were more combat-type ships in that other group.
Admiral Jack Fletcher had sortied earlier from Hawaii. His ships included carriers Saratoga and Enterprise, battleship North Carolina, 6 cruisers, 16 destroyers, and 3 oilers. After he rendezvoused with Wasp and other warships then at sea, the force numbered 89 ships, the greatest invasion armada yet assembled. Under cover of the bad weather, the assault force was able to move into enemy-controlled waters with little chance of detection. On board the transports, the men made final preparations and received landing assignments and briefings.
We were given orientation on the way, and it was strange because they didn't know anything about Guadalcanal. We were told there were no snakes, there was no wildlife that would create any problem.
They decided that I was going to be a machine gunner in the Higgins boat, so I got to spend most of the time sitting out on the deck loading the drums for the Lewis gun. I don't know much about Lewis guns. I never shot the thing, but I really can't believe that it would be a very reliable weapon. At least not the way I loaded it.
Before dawn on August 7th, the amphibious task force separated into two groups as it approached Savo Island, one bound for Guadalcanal and the other Tulagi.
As I recall, they got us up about 3 o'clock in the morning and fed us a big steak dinner, which I sure didn't need, but maybe somebody enjoyed it. And then we assembled on the deck, I guess, somewhere around dawn.
Escorting the amphibious force were 8 cruisers and a destroyer screen under Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, who deployed his ships northeast and southwest of Savo to protect the transports from the incursion of enemy submarines and aircraft. 100 miles to the south, Admiral Fletcher's carrier group turned slowly into the wind. 1 hour before sunrise, the great ships began launching their planes. The pattern of future campaigns in the Pacific was about to be demonstrated on the beaches of Tulagi and Guadalcanal. The Japanese were not aware that the enemy was upon them. The first shells from the cruiser Quincy's turrets hurled America's reply to the nation that contrived Pearl Harbor. August 7th, 1942, the United States of America takes the offensive against the Empire of Japan.
Daylight, they started shelling the islands, Guadalcanal and Tulagi, and there were planes in the air bombing the area over there where they found the concentrations at, I guess.
We figured that was going to chase them all away and put them all down. It looked to us like they were doing a pretty good job.
6- and 8-inch naval guns spouted flame as thousands of tense Marines began to move slowly down the cargo nets suspended from the decks of the transports.
Had to climb down the rope landing nets down the side of the ship and try and time the surge of the Higgins boat with the roll of the ship so that when you stepped off the landing net, you hit the boat instead of falling in the water between the boat and the ship. And fortunately, I think most of us made it.
Well, it was pretty scary, I'll tell you. They loaded about 4 Higgins boats at a time, and they'd go out and they'd load the next 4, and then they'd go out and circle, and they'd go out. When they got the Higgins boats all loaded, they spread out and all went in and hit the beach at the same time in different areas.
11,000 Marines would go ashore in the first amphibious assault by U.S. forces since 1898. The day of hit and run in the Pacific was over. The hour of hit and stay had come. The first Marines ashore in the campaign to capture the Solomons landed not on Guadalcanal, but on Tulagi. Just 2 miles long and half a mile wide, its proximity to nearby Florida Island made the capture of certain key features on Florida essential. A promontory on Florida overlooked the landing beach on Tulagi, and it was feared that Japanese artillery could wreak havoc on the amphibious force if this strategic point remained in Japanese hands. In addition to Tulagi, 2 small enemy-held islets, Gavutu and Tanambogo, were also to be seized. The 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines landed unopposed near the village of Halita on Florida Island. They quickly reached the desired promontory and successfully secured the flank. The landing at Tulagi went off as scheduled at 0800.
Where I landed at, we had to wade, we jumped over the side and had to wade waist deep on into the island because it was coral. And I'll tell you, it was pretty rough with a pack on your back, and of course I didn't have a gun. They didn't give us guns when we first went out there. But we had a pretty heavy pack on our back with our medical supplies. And Red Cross on your shoulder, which we got rid of. They were using them for targets. There wasn't much contact with the Japs until we got inland about 100 yards.
Upon reaching the shore, the 1st Raider Battalion and the 2nd Battalion 5th Marines began to make their way inland. The Raiders encountered Japanese resistance almost immediately. During the first day's action, the Raiders advanced toward the southeastern tip of Tulagi. At dusk, the units consolidated and dug in for the night.
That first night on Tulagi was indicative of what the Marines would face throughout the campaign in the Pacific. The Japanese launched 4 different counterattacks, which were all thrown back, but the ferocity of those attacks was really shocking to the Marines.
Over the next day and a half, the Raiders continued their push down the island. A cave complex and dug-in positions at the base of a deep man-made cut provided the most intense fighting on Tulagi. By the evening of August 9th, effective Japanese resistance on Tulagi had been eliminated. Gavutu and Tanambogo, connected by a causeway and each with prominent hills held by Japanese forces, were to be seized by 2 companies of the Marine 1st Parachute Battalion. The plan called for an amphibious assault to capture Gavutu before mounting an attack on Tanambogo over the causeway. Problems were immediately encountered when the assault boats were forced to divert from their intended landing area at a concrete seaplane ramp. Naval shelling prior to the invasion was so devastating that it had completely destroyed the original landing site. Forced to divert farther north, the Paramarines found themselves pinned down by fire from 3 sides. Casualties were taken, but gradually the Marines gained the upper hand. By 1800, the American flag flew over Gavutu, but above Tanambogo, a rising sun banner whipped defiantly. The following day, Tanambogo was inundated by a series of naval and aerial attacks. Tragically, bombs from Navy Dauntlesses fell short of their target, and several Marines on Gavutu were killed or wounded. Naval shelling proved more reliable, as first the destroyer San Juan and later Buchanan swept in to blast Japanese positions. At 1600, just minutes after Buchanan's devastating bombardment, the Marines landed on Tanambogo to little opposition. About 750 Japanese had died defending Tulagi and Gavutu Tanambogo, while 144 Americans were killed and nearly 200 wounded. The capture of the islands had not been costly as measured by the heartless business of war, yet it seemed so when compared with what faced the men scheduled to land on Guadalcanal. At 0910, landing craft carrying the 1st and 3rd Battalions, 5th Marines, jarred to a stop on Beach Red, Guadalcanal.
The landing itself, completely unopposed. There was nobody on the beach when we got there. We did hear some firing, and it was Seabees that had been on the beach for hours before we got there that were shooting coconuts out of trees. We were supposed to be scared, and we were, till we found out, hell, there was nothing there.
By necessity, Vandegrift's plan was not complex. The 5th Marines were to proceed along the coast to secure the flank, while the 1st Marines would move inland along the Tenaroo River and secure a grassy knoll identified as Mount Austin that lay a short distance from Beach Red.
We're supposed to be heading up into the mountains. There was some kind of a Japanese lookout up on the mountains, and our objective was to go take that, but we never got into the mountains at all.
Even as the Americans were establishing their first foothold in the Solomons, the Japanese were preparing to push them out. From Rabaul, the Japanese sent 27 twin-engine bombers covered by 18 Zeros to harass the American invaders. Fortunately for the transports, the planes were armed with bombs rather than torpedoes. The raid, which came in at 12:30 hours, damaged 1 destroyer before departing. While positions along the shore were prepared and supplies piled up, the Marines continued their advance.
The whole countryside there was either coconut groves or big high grass fields. Grass, well, some of it as high as your head. And it was just miserable going. And so we struggled along, pulling our communications carts and dragging everything. And I guess by the end of the day, we got back up, just starting back up into the hills.
The password went out, and there was some shooting going on in the night, but it was mostly between guards that were set up on the perimeter and people that didn't know or had forgotten the password. I don't think anybody got hurt, but they very well could have.
August 8th began with a westward advance by all Marine forces on Guadalcanal. The 5th Marines continued toward Lunga Point, while the 1st Marines swung toward the Lunga River and approached the airfield from the south. Contact with small groups of Japanese began to occur as the Marines closed in on the airfield, but resistance was quickly overrun, and by 1600, the Marines had taken the airstrip.
The airstrip was essentially a wide spot in the road and was only marginally useful at the time that the Marines occupied that area, and was badly in need of improvement with pierced steel planking called Marston matting, or with gravel that could extend the useful length of the runway.
2 enemy camps and a large amount of equipment were also captured. Japanese trucks were put to use in hauling supplies from the beachhead, and large caches of food, chiefly rice, would prove invaluable in the coming days. At 12:30 hours, there was another Japanese air raid. A formation of 40 Japanese dive and torpedo bombers flew into a literal storm of steel thrown up by warships near Tulagi. Those that escaped the intense anti-aircraft fire were fallen upon by fighters from WASP, but one plane managed to send a torpedo crashing into the side of destroyer Jarvis. Another crashed through an open hatch on the transport Elliott, setting the ship ablaze. Unable to extinguish the fire, Elliott was scuttled later that day. All but one of the 45 bombers that made the attack was shot down. Prior to the air raid, a force of Japanese ships was spotted steaming toward Guadalcanal. The report passed through 7 separate communication relays before reaching Guadalcanal, and by then, even the direction of the Japanese had become confused. Under the command of Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, the task force approached unchecked. By nightfall on August 8th, the beachhead extended a mile inland and 4 miles along the shore. The Marines owned the airstrip and nearly all the ground required to defend it. Vandegrift and his staff had reason to feel optimistic, but that feeling was not to last. Summoned aboard the Macaulay by Rear Admiral Richmond Turner, Vandegrift learned that Admiral Jack Fletcher's covering force, including all 3 aircraft carriers, had withdrawn due to fuel shortage and aircraft losses. Fletcher's departure left Turner with no choice. He would have to withdraw the amphibious task force, less than half unloaded, the following day, leaving behind only a small force of cruisers and destroyers. While Mikawa was advancing at 26 knots, Crutchley's ships assumed their night dispositions. Due to the 3 entrances to the Sound, the Allied forces were compelled to divide into 3 patrolling squadrons: Southern, Northern, and Eastern. Behind the screen of warships, the transports lay off Lunga Point. When Mikawa's force slipped unseen past the 2 destroyer pickets at the mouth of the Sound, the stage was set for the U.S. Navy's most humiliating defeat. Using standard Japanese tactics, Mikawa first launched torpedoes. At 0145, a pair found the Australian ship Canberra. 6- and 8-inch gunfire followed, and Canberra was finished. Moments later, the heavy cruiser Chicago was hit, and while she managed to limp away, Chicago failed to report that an attack was underway. 15 minutes later, the Japanese fell upon the northern force, cruising sedately along in patrol formation. Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria were quickly gunned into sinking hooks. Crutchley's fleet became the first layer of steel in what would become known as Iron Bottom Sound.
After Admiral Mikawa defeats the American Navy off Savo Island, the transports, who are unloading at Lunga Point, are completely defenseless. However, he elects at that point to withdraw because he is afraid of an American carrier strike with the first light. Now, obviously, if he had known that the American carriers had already withdrawn, he would have continued and destroyed the transports and leaving the Marines completely at the mercy of the Japanese Navy.
August 9th, Marines watched as Allied vessels picked up survivors and then slipped away through columns of smoke from the still burning remains of the American fleet.
People were washing up ashore. Some of them were swimming ashore. I don't know how many boats were sunk out there. I think I've read since then, but it was kind of a mess as far as our Navy was concerned.
In the Battle of Savo Island, 700 men were wounded and nearly 1,100 perished. For the American Navy, it was the worst disaster since Pearl Harbor. In just half an hour, the Japanese had changed the entire picture of an easy American victory at Guadalcanal. Virtually defenseless, the battered American Navy had no choice but to withdraw. When the last ships left, late on the 9th, General Vandegrift's Marines were all alone.
All the ships pulled out, and they weren't done unloading yet, but they just all bailed out on us, and by mid-afternoon they were all gone. So we did feel kind of halfway abandoned, and to be real honest, we didn't see any more American ships for a long time.
The Marines really were left on a shoestring, and they started calling the Guadalcanal operation not Operation Watchtower, but Operation Shoestring, because supplies were so much in demand.
The withdrawal of the transports had left the Marines with only part of their supplies, and now with no air cover, it became imperative to get what supplies had come ashore off the beaches where they were extremely vulnerable to attack. No air support would be available until the airfield was completed, and that task was made difficult by a lack of proper equipment, most of which sailed away before it could be unloaded. Forced to employ Japanese equipment to improve the runway, the engineers' task was further complicated by the unrivaled Japanese air superiority. Operating from bases in the northern and central Solomons, Japanese planes dominated the skies.
We didn't have any air support at all, so the Japs were free to do whatever they wanted to do from an aerial standpoint.
The Japanese unleashed full fury from the sky. They went all out to destroy the airfield, planning to retake it later.
The problem at Guadalcanal was that the Japanese had the ability to come down and bomb it from both Bougainville and Rabaul.
5 days after the landing, the airstrip was ready, and the Marines christened it Henderson Field to honor a fallen buddy. The field was designed and construction started by the Japanese, and it was completed with captured equipment. But the planes that would use it were American. General Vandegrift believed the Japanese were certain to take advantage of the Marines' predicament and launch an attack. Perimeter defenses were thus improved and patrols sent out to probe for the enemy. One of these patrols, led by Colonel Frank Getke, was ambushed as it approached Matanikau village on August 13. Only 3 of the units to the river. On August 19th, 3 companies of the 5th Marines attacked west against the Japanese concentrated near Matanikau village. In the first battle of the Matanikau, the Marine attack destroyed the small Japanese garrison. That same day, a patrol was sent to investigate reports of Japanese activity east of the Marine perimeter. They had stumbled into a Japanese reconnaissance party, and in the ensuing firefight, 31 Japanese were killed. A search of the bodies afterward revealed helmets marked with the Japanese Army Star rather than the Navy's chrysanthemum, leaving no doubt that infantry troops were being filtered ashore. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki's force of 900 men landed a day earlier at Taivu Point, well east of the airfield's defenses. At the same time, 500 more went ashore to the west at Kokumbona. These landings were the first run of what the Marines came to call the Cactus Express, a nightly run of cruisers, destroyers, and transports that shuttled troops and supplies to Guadalcanal. Later known as the Tokyo Express, these operations achieved the regularity of a crack railroad run. As defenses were being improved to guard against an attack from the east, the familiar sound of incoming aircraft signaled the Marines to start for their foxholes. However, these planes had come to land at Henderson Field, not to bomb it. The arrival of 12 Marine Dauntlesses and 19 Wildcats provided a tremendous boost for the men on the ground.
When Lieutenant Colonel Dick Mangrum and Major John L. Smith arrived with their SBDs and F-4Fs, it immediately gave a huge boost to morale among the Marine infantrymen on Guadalcanal, who had become accustomed to seeing only airplanes with rising suns painted on their wings. But now there were white-starred airplanes, and even though they arrived without much maintenance capability, at least they were able to start intercepting the Japanese daily bombing raids.
After we got some planes, that made all the difference in the world. Then from then on, they kept building up our Air Force, and it got to where it was a pretty respectable unit after a while.
Across the Tenaru, Ichiki was preparing his troops to retake the airfield. Early on the morning of August 21st, he gathered his men at the mouth of the river. Colonel Ichiki's force of 900 men was to be joined later by 1,500 more. But Ichiki had been given orders that permitted him to attack whenever he saw fit. Intelligence reports indicated that the American presence on the island was no greater than a raiding party cowering in a defensive perimeter around the airfield. With the element of surprise lost through the encounter east of the Tenaru, Ichiki decided to attack. At 0130, the Japanese charged across the Tenaru with bayonets fixed, and the Marines were ready for them.
We had one thing going for us. We had 37-millimeter guns with canister loads. A canister load is a load of essentially buckshot cast, I think, in beeswax. And there's an awful lot of shot there, and it spreads like a sawed-off shotgun. And we had 2 or 3 of those dug in covering that sand pit, plus machine guns and everything else. And it was just an absolute massacre.
It was almost like a turkey shoot as the Japanese came across and were trying to get across the river, almost at the mouth of the river where you could wade in the sand, but there was a slaughterhouse there.
Greatly outnumbered at the point of attack, the Japanese were cut down on the banks of the Tenaru. Only a few dazed bands survived, and at morning light, the Marines crossed the shallow river to carry the attack.
They moved the 2nd Battalion around behind them to trap them, and then they just started shelling the bejesus out of the spot they were in. Some of them were trying to swim away, and it was a case of not so much can you get him, but who can get him first. And then they brought the tanks up, and the tanks moved out into this little peninsula sort of area where they were. And the tanks thrashed around out there flushing them out. And they just were heaped up on the sand spit at the mouth of the river.
By dusk, nearly 800 Japanese, including Colonel Ichiki, were dead. Somehow only 44 Marines were lost. Henderson had been defended for the first time, and the planes, which had arrived the day before, were safe.
The battle at the Tenarue is actually fought on Alligator Creek, which is a tributary of the Ilu River. And this just points out once again how poor American intelligence was on the terrain of the island. But the real importance of the Battle of the Tenarue is that the Marines were able to just crushingly defeat the Japanese. And the Japanese at this point had a reputation as tenacious and ferocious fighters. And this victory goes a long way in boosting Marine morale.
Ichiki's failure prompted Admiral Yamamoto to stage a more determined effort to drive the Americans from the island. The 1,500 men that were to reinforce Ichiki again sailed for Guadalcanal, and on August 21st rendezvoused with a powerful task force sent to support operations ashore. Yamamoto hoped to draw the American fleet into battle and planned to detach a diversionary group baited with the carrier Ryujo to attract the American flat tops. Fletcher's carrier groups, built around Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp, had been patrolling south of the Solomons since August 9th, outside the range of Japanese search aircraft. Based on radio traffic analysis, Fletcher was aware that a large Japanese force had sailed.
Starting with the Battle of Midway, the Japanese are much more efficient about changing their codes, and those efforts kind of forestall American moves to gain intelligence by breaking their codes. But we're still able to gather intelligence from traffic analysis. And by that I mean from the amount and frequency of radio traffic, we can define the amount of activity being carried out by the Japanese, but we are no longer able to tell what the intention of that activity is.
Intelligence gathering was further complicated by the vast reaches of the Pacific. Before an attack could be mounted, the target had to be located. Both sides relied on aerial reconnaissance to fix enemy positions.
In carrier warfare, job one was find the opposition, because that gave you enormous advantage. Not only could you position your forces for maximum benefit, but you could usually get in the first lick. Most of our reconnaissance was done by carrier aircraft, whereas the Japanese preferred to retain their strike aircraft for attack missions, and therefore they devoted usually more than half of their reconnaissance sorties to cruiser or battleship-based float planes, which were fired off catapults and recovered well underway and picked up out of the water with a crane. Both sides, of course, had flying boats that had enormous range and time on station, but those were not always available in the carrier phases of the battle. So both sides knew that reconnaissance was important. You have to know where the enemy is in order to get in the first lick, but it's just the platforms that the Japanese chose to emphasize is what made them different from the American perspective.
Bound for Guadalcanal, the Japanese transport convoy was located by Catalina search planes on August 20th. However, the supporting task force went undetected. A dispatch from SINCPAC indicated all Japanese carriers were north of Truk. In light of this report, Wasp departed to refuel on the 23rd. The following day, the opposing forces located each other, and as Yamamoto had hoped, Ryujo drew the attention of the Americans.
Japanese doctrine was extremely complex. The Japanese were great believers in dispersion and in decoy forces, and they kept to that pattern absolutely throughout the war, for as long as they had a viable navy.
As American air groups left in pursuit of Ryujo, their plan of attack was largely dictated by the performance characteristics of the aircraft they flew.
it was preferable for the dive bombers to attack first so that their bomb hits and even the near misses could be of use in reducing enemy visibility, would make it easier for the torpedo planes to make their approach, which of necessity was at very low level, often as low as 50 feet, at perhaps 120, 130 knots, very low speed. The third element in the equation was the fighter aircraft, both friendly and enemy. The purpose of the escorting fighters was to engage the enemy's defending fighters and, as much as possible, keep them away from friendly dive bombers and especially from torpedo planes, which really had very little room to maneuver.
The wisdom of fighter cover was proven emphatically at Midway, where unescorted U.S. torpedo squadrons were decimated by the Japanese. But in spite of improved air cover, problems still plagued American aviators.
We started out what they call a TBD, and that was made by Douglas. But most of them got wiped out in Midway. We were one of the first squadrons that got TBMs, and they were a good deal faster. They were built, they took a bad beating and still flew. And the problem we had with the torpedo planes was we didn't use them much because we didn't have good torpedoes. We had to slow up to 200 knots at 200 feet, no higher than 200 feet. But you had to go in a definite pattern so that they'd converge, theoretically. And then the torpedoes didn't run right.
At 1550, the attack on Ryujo began. Dauntless dive bombers from Saratoga fell on the hapless carrier, scoring several hits. Then Avengers came in from different directions so that no matter which way she turned, the enemy carrier would still be exposed to their torpedoes. Ryujo never had a chance, but she had served Yamamoto's purpose. Admiral Nagumo, commander of the carrier force, ordered his planes aloft, certain that the Americans had flown off all their planes to attack Ryujo. Admiral Fletcher, however, had not forgotten the lessons of the Coral Sea or Midway, and he had 53 Wildcats aloft, waiting. The initial exchange was strictly a pilot's battle, as American and Japanese planes tangled outside the gun range of Enterprise and her screen of escorts. Dive-bombing Vals and torpedo-launching Kates, covered by a screen of Zeros, scrimmaged wildly with the American planes. At 1641, the Japanese dive bombers commenced their run. American ships opened up on the tiny silhouettes of the Japanese planes. Wildcats slashed at them as they came down, risking friendly anti-aircraft fire. But the Japanese pilots never faltered. Enterprise twisted and turned, trying to avoid the coming onslaught. But at 1714, a 1,000-pound bomb crashed through her aft elevator, penetrating to the third deck before it exploded. Moments later, a second bomb caused a tremendous fire and explosion when it hit 5-inch powder bags stored below deck. A mile and a quarter astern of Enterprise, North Carolina also drew the interest of the enemy pilots. At least 10 Vals made a coordinated attack on the battleship, but their bombs splashed harmlessly in the water. The Japanese attack, which missed Saratoga completely, was over in a matter of minutes. Enterprise, listing and pouring out smoke, still raced along at 27 knots. Damage control focused on extinguishing the blaze set by the second bomb. Men with hoses played streams of water on the flames, while others spread foam to smother burning oil. An hour after the attack, Enterprise turned into the wind to receive aircraft.
To a certain extent, Eastern Solomons is one of the archetypal carrier battles that has ever been fought. It was not a major battle by later standards, or even certainly compared to what had already transpired at Coral Sea and Midway, but within the Guadalcanal campaign itself, it pretty much set the pattern for the next several months. We now had on both sides combat experienced aviators, some of whom had been in one or more of the previous carrier battles, and you also had a growing institutional experience with the ship's companies and commanders such as Nagumo and Fletcher, who had fought each other previously.
Had enemy torpedo planes not been successfully driven off, the Big E may have been sunk during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. As it was, the battle ended indecisively. The Japanese had lost Ryujo and a significant number of aircraft and their pilots, but they had succeeded in crippling Enterprise. The most significant fact in the aftermath of the battle was that American planes had turned back the Japanese troop transports, spoiling Yamamoto's plan to dislodge the Americans on Guadalcanal. Following the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, dive bombers from Enterprise landed at Guadalcanal and were there for nearly a month.
Throughout the campaign, Henderson Field became either a divert field or a semi-permanent base for U.S. Navy carrier aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Turner Caldwell led his Dauntlesses into the field as an expedient means of avoiding a night recovery aboard Enterprise, and such was the need by that time that they were immediately absorbed into the generic organization of what became known as the Cactus Air Force, and were significant in the effort to keep Japanese shipping from adequately resupplying enemy forces on Guadalcanal.
During this phase of the campaign, the Army Air Force contributed a squadron of P-400s.
Although it was a fast airplane, something around 350 plus mile per hour, with a potent armament, 20 or 37 millimeter cannon, plus 50 and 30 caliber machine guns, it had very poor altitude performance and consequently was usually limited to missions up around 15,000 feet. The fellas I've known who flew it took sort of a philosophical aspect or view of the endeavor. They like to say that a P-400 was simply a P-40 with a zero behind it.
Another late August arrival was the 6th CB Battalion and the equipment they brought with them.
We arrived one night in the dark, and we circled around out there and had no idea where we were. And then in the next morning, they told us, this is Guadalcanal, and this is where you're going ashore.
In addition to the improvement of Henderson, the CBs were responsible for a wide variety of construction duties.
Some of our outfit went directly onto Guadalcanal, and some of us went over to Tulagi because Tulagi had a much better harbor. Guadalcanal was exposed. There was no harbor there at all. You had to fight your way through the surf. There had been a little dinky old dock there about probably 200 feet long in the Tulagi harbor. And so we took off right away to extend that dock so that it had, make 900 or 1,000 feet long so you could get a full-size ship coming into it.
As August drew to a close, events on Guadalcanal settled into routine monotony. Daily, the Japanese would stage air raids, but the long flight from Rabaul meant bomber formations could be expected between 11:30 and 14:30.
At certain times of the day, you didn't want to be around Henderson Field. And I mean, it was heavy stuff. It'd shake the ground wherever you were at.
The whole target was the runway, and there'd be between 20 and 30 twin-engine bombers. And every day they came by and dropped their bombs and went away again.
This operational pattern, combined with reports from coast watchers and an air warning radar system, provided just enough time for the Wildcats to gain sufficient altitude.
With the F-4F-4 Wildcat, approximately 45 minutes advance notice was needed in order to scramble the fighters, get them to the altitude they needed, roughly 30,000 feet, in order to be in a favorable position to attack the Japanese bombers before they could actually drop their bombs.
The F-4F Wildcat, the only effective fighter available during this early phase of the campaign, had advantages and disadvantages over its primary adversary, the Japanese Zero. Although the Zero was able to outclimb and outmaneuver the Wildcat, the F-4F was much sturdier, and combat tactics were developed to exploit this advantage. Individual combat was avoided in favor of team tactics. Flying wing to wing, two Wildcats could more than hold their own against the Zero, and it was thus that the legend of the invincible Japanese Air Force was blasted into flaming wreckage. A curious tactical situation had developed at Guadalcanal as mastery of the seas was exchanged every 12 hours. The Americans ruled during daylight hours as ships unloaded and launches dashed around the Sound. Twilight signaled a quick Allied exodus and the arrival of the Tokyo Express. These troop carriers and their escorts would dash in to discharge soldiers or freight, and while departing, they would toss a few shells in the Marines' direction.
Yeah, we got some shelling from the sea, and it did blow up a lot of stuff, but luckily we were never in that particular line of fire. We could hear it and we could see it, but we were not embarrassed to dig a foxhole pretty near anywhere we were and get it done real fast so that there was a place where you could dive into if trouble started. Some people made fun of that, but they didn't survive, and we did.
I laid in a foxhole one night, and they was shooting at us with a pretty good-sized gun, and it was sizzling right over the tops of our heads and through the coconut trees. And that's pretty scary, laying in a hole, not knowing where the next one's going to hit.
The last day of August brought more grief to the Marines on Cactus when the carrier Saratoga, on defensive patrol southeast of Guadalcanal, was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. Though she was later repaired, Saratoga was out of the fight for Guadalcanal. Vandegrift learned of her loss with a sinking heart, for intelligence reports indicated that the Tokyo Express had been landing troops and supplies with increasing regularity. Major General Kiyotaki Kawaguchi, commander of the 35th Infantry Regiment, had more than 5,000 troops near Taivu Point, more than twice the number of Marines believed to be on the island. While American manpower was grossly underestimated, Kawaguchi could expect to have overwhelming superiority at the point of attack, with the additional advantage of choosing when and where it would occur. Moreover, the Japanese would be facing defenders who were beginning to show the effects of little food and even less rest.
When food gets short, people start getting nasty, We knew we had no support because the food stuff wasn't coming in. We were scrounging. We were finding Japanese rice sacks. They had big woven sacks that you would find out in the brush. So we had that.
The everyday rations were pretty slim and pretty poor because a good part of our food supply went away with the ships when they left. And so we were eating captured Jap oats that they used to feed their horses and captured Jap rice. I managed to find somewhere, I don't remember where it was, a can of Jap pork and beans packed with seaweed. And I guess I'm not very generous or kind of an animal-like type. I hid my can of pork and beans and sneaked off into a gully and ate it all.
Hunger aside, day-to-day existence on Guadalcanal was difficult in the extreme.
The thing that people will always talk about regarding not just Henderson Field but Guadalcanal is that it was widely held it was the only place on Earth where you could stand up to your knees in mud and still have dust blow in your eye.
Living conditions weren't too good. You slept on the ground. We didn't have tent camps or tents to live in. It was a case of shelter halves and whatever you can rustle up to keep the rain off. Fortunately, we were young and flexible and stupid. Didn't seem to bother us too much, but...
Subject to frequent shelling and constantly under the threat of air attack, the Marines were additionally harassed through a variety of Japanese tactics.
At night, they had, we called them Washing Machine Charlie, some kind of a little airplane that made funny noises, and he'd just come flying around, and it just kept everybody awake more than anything else. He never really did any serious damage. He'd always drop one bomb.
The Washing Machine Charlie was a nuisance almost every night. You never knew when he was going to drop a bomb or what he's going to do, and he came in the dark.
But these Japanese attempts to discourage the Marines were not without their lighter moments.
This damn Jap submarine would come every day without fail, and he'd just cruise up and down offshore and shoot at us. We had half-tracks with 75-millimeter guns mounted on them. Every day they'd pull out and go tearing down to the beach to shoot back at him, and they never could hit him. And I guess one day we had an old Marine Corps character. I think he was older than the hills even then. He'd been in Haiti and Nicaragua and God knows where all, China, named Lou Diamond. And he was the master mortarman of all mortarmen that ever were. And he took his mortar platoon down to the beach one day. And he set up that mortar, and damned if he didn't hit that submarine. A mortar is not going to hurt a submarine, but it sure made him submerge.
The enemy buildup east of the Marines' perimeter was centered on the village of Tasimboko. Native scouts had placed their number at 2,000 to 3,000, but these reports were met with skepticism by Marine intelligence. However, as a precautionary measure, it was decided the reports should be investigated. The Marines selected for the raid were the 1st Raider and 1st Parachute Battalions, recently arrived from Tulagi. At 0530 on September 8th, the 1st Raiders under the command of Colonel Merritt Edson sloshed ashore at Taivu Point. Edson deployed his men to attack west toward Tasimboko, and at about 0800 they made contact with Kawaguchi's rear echelon. Air support was called in, and soon Henderson's aviators were pouring fire on the enemy. The Raiders mounted an enveloping attack, and when it made contact with the enemy, resistance was quickly routed. Edson's men entered the village to find it deserted. Large quantities of material and a large radio station were systematically destroyed. The raid had been a complete success. On September 9th, a new airstrip, Fighter 1, was ready for use. 2,000 yards east of Henderson, the strip was built by the Seabees.
Henderson Field was being used for the heavily laden aircraft, both on landing and takeoff. And the fighters, they didn't want all that traffic on just one runway.
Little more than a field of mown grass, Fighter 1 would provide an extremely important resource in days to come. As September entered its second week, barge convoys to Kamimbo Bay had swelled the number of Japanese in the area to nearly 2,000. Under Colonel Oka, they were to coordinate with Kawaguchi's force to attack on September 12th. Planning to move by sea to an area near the Matanikau, inadequate shipping crippled the plan. The two Japanese units were 70 miles apart, with dense jungle and American Marines in between. Kawaguchi thus designated Oka's force the left wing and slated them to attack the southwest quarter of the Marine perimeter. The main assault would come from the south, led by Kawaguchi's 3 infantry battalions. The remnants of Ichiki's force, now designated the Kuma Battalion, would attack from the southeast. The Japanese advance began on September 9th, but soon bogged down. Unable to clear more than just a narrow path, the march through the jungle was torturous. Soaked in sweat or drenched by rain, the Japanese plodded on. Ever mindful of exposing their advance, open areas had to be avoided rather than sought. But however slowly, the Japanese were coming. Southwest of Henderson, a broken grassy ridge stretched 1,000 yards through the jungle to the banks of the Lunga River. When the Japanese attacked, Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Thomas and Colonel Edson were convinced it would be there. They presented their conclusions to Vandegrift, and on September 10th, Edson moved the raiders and paratroops to what he jokingly termed a rest area. By 1400, they were fortifying what his men referred to as Edson's Ridge. As the Japanese approached, Marine patrol encounters with the enemy increased in frequency until it became nearly impossible to move outside the perimeter.
The reserve battalion had to provide a company strength patrol every day. The company that had the patrol that day drew double rations. And the radio operators that went with the company got to eat with the company. So we were prone to volunteering with a fair degree of regularity. But anyhow, I was with the company, and we were, just short of the river, and the lieutenant said, "This will be the CP," so we set our radio up, and the rest of the company went on, and just a few minutes later, it was just a god-awful firefight broke out. Pretty soon we see these guys running back down the trail. There'd be a couple, and then one, and then a few more. And so we're wondering what is going on, and we're waiting for somebody to come and tell us to pack up and move out. And pretty soon the first sergeant came backing down the trail with his Tommy gun at the ready, and we asked him what's going on, and he turned around and jumped like we'd shot. And, "What the hell are you bastards doing here? Don't you know I'm the only one left between you and them?" And so we debated for 2 seconds over whether to put a grenade in the radio and blow it up or pack it up and take it. And we decided we'd probably get court-martialed if we blew it up, so we packed it up and took it. But it didn't take long to pack.
The Marines on Edson's Ridge drove themselves to complete their fortifications, a series of strong points with overlapping fields of fire. The terrain and denseness of the jungle, combined with the small number of men, precluded anything resembling a continuous line. To the rear, artillery batteries were registered to give Edson's men close support. The only available reserves, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, was moved into supporting positions. The Marine commanders were certain the enemy was coming that night. It was up to the raiders on the ridge to stop them. At the point of attack, 840 Marines would face over 2,000 Japanese. Below the ridge, Kawaguchi rushed to organize his men. The march through the jungle had scattered his detachments, and another day of preparation was in order. But he had assured Rabal that he would attack on the 12th. With no means of radio communication, Kawaguchi had no choice. He deployed his men along the Lunga, opposite the Marine right flank, and awaited the naval bombardment that was to precede his attack. 3 hours before midnight on September 12th, 20 minutes of bombardment from ships offshore signaled the beginning of the battle for Edson's Ridge. Machine gun and rifle fire broke out, and the Kawaguchi Brigade came pouring out of the jungle, probing for weak spots in the Marine line. They drove the raiders back and advanced down the Lunga to attempt an encirclement. But they lost their way once they left the riverbank, and mortar and artillery fire drove them back. On the left, the paratroops were struck. Holes were driven through their lines, but the Japanese failed to capitalize. At dawn, the Marines counterattacked, but there were not enough men to carry the fight.
After this first night on the Bloody Ridge, Colonel Edson will pull the Marines back 100 yards, which will allow him to tighten his perimeter, The defense will be much improved. Fields of fire will be improved. The Japanese will have another 100 yards of open ground to attack across, and that gives him some more space to employ his artillery firepower on those attacking Japanese.
By the afternoon of the 13th, Marines on the ridge were sleepwalking after nearly 72 sleepless hours. They had expected to be relieved by Vandegrift's reserve, but air raids prevented this. Several air attacks struck that day. The Cactus Air Force had grown substantially with the arrival of 60 planes, and they raised havoc with the bombers and their escorts. Wildcats from Henderson intercepted a Japanese reconnaissance flight.
Japanese fighter planes had 30 caliber and 20 millimeters, and the 20 millimeters were very effective, but they were heavy, and their planes were light, and they couldn't carry very many of them. And so our gunners and our fighter planes had an advantage. They sight with tracers when they're on you, and so they would use their 30 caliber tracers to try to sight you. And when you could see the tracers going from red to green or green to red, you knew they'd cut in the 20 millimeter. They thought they had you. And so you do different maneuvers. But anyway, they could shoot our airplanes up pretty good, and we could still fly. Theirs would fall apart. If they saw a wing or something, you'd see the wings coming down like a fine cone. You'd look up and plummet, and then the wings would be floating. We had a great advantage over the Japanese. If their airplanes that hit, they were gone. Ours could fly. I was always thankful. That's why at the first of the war, they were always claiming the Japanese were so much more maneuverable, and they had the little zeros, and they could outfight everybody. Well, that's true, but they didn't have any weight, they didn't have any armament, they didn't have nothing in that. All those left. All those were gone pretty soon. I think they just bet on the wrong horse when they bet on the light airplane and the 30 caliber gun.
During the raid, 4 Zeros fell, but the Americans lost 2 planes and their pilots, while 2 others were wounded. The usual bombing raid followed shortly, but because the Japanese were unsure of the situation on the ground, they bypassed Henderson and droned on toward Taivu Point, thought to be in American hands since the Tasimboko raid. They dumped their bombs on their helpless countrymen who had reoccupied the area. At Rabaul, Japanese commanders were puzzled. They were certain that Kawaguchi had been successful in his bid to retake the airfield, but the bullet holes in planes returning from Guadalcanal suggested otherwise. Kawaguchi had been thwarted in his initial attempt when neither Colonel Oka in the west nor the Kuma Battalion in the east attacked as scheduled. As night began to fall, General Kawaguchi was certain a better coordinated effort would overwhelm the Americans. Edson's men had prepared a defensive line 1,800 yards long. Deployed in combat groups of approximately platoon strength, they were organized at about 100-yard intervals. At 18:30, the first blows fell on the ridge as 2,000 Japanese sprinted toward the Marines in waves. They bent back the lines, but they could not break them. Even as the raiders were resisting the charge, shells began to drop on Henderson. To the east, the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, faced the Kuma Battalion.
We were spread out awful thin. It was just almost a one-man line. We did have double apron wire out, and as good a defense as you could put together. But there was this field of high grass in front of us, and they had come through the grass. Again, they hit in the middle of the night. Why they picked the night to do all these things, I'm not sure. But they hit in the middle of the night, and everybody from Headquarters Company spent the rest of the night hauling ammunition up to the line because they were just using it like it was going out of style.
U.S. artillerymen rained shells down on the Kuma Battalion as they struggled through the barbed wire. Those who got through were met by machine gun fire. Back on the ridge, only about 300 Marines remained. Edson pulled them back to the spine of the ridge, only 1,500 yards from Henderson. But there they stayed while the Japanese suffered an onslaught of steel. Colonel Edson called in artillery fire, bringing it ever closer to his own lines. 105mm shells rained down on the Japanese. Throughout the long dawn of September 14th, the Battle of Edson's Ridge, known thereafter as Bloody Ridge, flickered and flared. At daybreak, P-400 spewed cannon fire into Kawaguchi's assembly points, while tanks drove back the remainder of the Kuma battalion.
They went up and down through the grass to flush them out. And these bodies laying out in the wire. There was a Jap officer that somehow or other had gotten over or through the wire. And we're standing there. Every once in a while, a Jap machine gun would open up, and you'd just watch where the tracers were going, and when they started coming down towards you, you'd duck. But we're standing there, and that dead Jap officer rolled over and tossed a grenade. And so we ducked. He was dead after that.
The third prong of Kawaguchi's master plan, Colonel Oka's force, finally attacked the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines at daybreak. The attack was driven off with the help of an artillery barrage, as were several feeble attempts later that day. The men that remained from all 3 Japanese units were forced to withdraw into the jungle.
I think it was the morning after the battle we had on the Bloody Ridge episode thing. The cooks showed up with our usual ration of oatmeal, and you had to pick the worms and the weevils and the bugs out of it. Some of them walked out, but some of them you had to pick out with a fork, and powdered milk. And they brought that up for our breakfast, and the colonel just hit the ceiling. And he got on those cooks, and it's not really repeatable what he called them, but he said, "You get back there and you be back here in 30 minutes with pancakes for these men." And by God, they were. Of course, they had weevils in them too, but at least they were cooked weevils.
The Marines achieved a significant victory in the Battle of Bloody Ridge. Had the Japanese succeeded in retaking Henderson Field, the Marines would have had a difficult time holding the island. The raiders and paratroops suffered 263 American casualties, with 59 killed or missing. Recorded losses in other units added another 38 killed and 18 wounded. Japanese losses were estimated at more than 700 killed and 500 wounded. The last major action in September occurred west of the Matanikau, where it was known the enemy's strength lay. On September 23rd, the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller, was sent to explore the area between the Matanikau and Kokumbona. It was the evening of the following day before any Japanese were encountered, and in the ensuing firefight, 32 Marine casualties were taken. Fearing he faced a large Japanese force, Puller radioed for assistance and was reinforced by the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. As the 2 battalions worked down the Matanikau on the 26th, they were taken under fire from Japanese positions across the river. It was decided they would hold their positions while the Raider Battalion moved to a point 2,000 yards upriver, where they would cross and attack the enemy from the flank and rear. However, as they moved up, they discovered a sizable force of Japanese had crossed to the east bank and occupied strong positions. The concentrated fire forced the raiders to cease their advance. At this juncture, the American attack degenerated even further. A garbled radio transmission led division headquarters to believe the Raider attack was meeting success, and 2 companies of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines were sent to cut off the supposedly retreating enemy. They landed unopposed, but soon encountered stiff resistance. A strong Japanese force began advancing on them, and the situation rapidly became critical. With no radio, the Marines resorted to spelling out "help" with white T-shirts. American aviators saw and reported the message. With his men trapped behind enemy lines, Puller organized a rescue convoy. The rescue flotilla had to fight its way through enemy fire, but succeeded in its mission. The destroyer Monson blasted a path to the beach along which the Marines were able to withdraw. The Marines were fortunate to have extricated themselves from their plight, and though extremely costly, valuable lessons were learned. The attack had been undertaken without meaningful intelligence on the enemy or the terrain and had escalated rapidly. There was no coordination of movement, and the forces deployed were unable to support each other. Air and artillery support also lacked coordination. They were mistakes Vandegrift vowed not to make again. On September 28th, 25 Japanese bombers and 40 Zeros tangled with 34 Wildcats in one of the largest air battles of the campaign. 7 bombers were shot down and the remainder returned to Rabaul riddled with bullets. Since the arrival of the Cactus Air Force, the American kill-to-loss ratio had remained extremely high. 3 of Henderson's aviators were the top American aces by this juncture. Major John Smith had 19 kills, Major Robert Gaylor had 11, and Captain Marion Carl had 16. During the early part of October, the Tokyo Express delivered upwards of 2,000 men and tons of much-needed supplies west of the Matanikau. Among the freshly landed troops was the elite Sendai 4th Infantry Division. The Japanese intended to advance to the east bank of the Matanikau as a prelude to a grand attack scheduled for October 17th. General Vandegrift also had designs on the Matanikau. Intelligence reports indicated a large enemy buildup in the region, and recent artillery shelling of Henderson added credence to these reports. Vandegrift planned to make a spoiling attack at the river mouth to focus Japanese attention in that area, while other forces crossed the Matanikau upriver to swing right and close the enemy from the rear. On October 7th, the advance began, and contact was made about 10:00 with enemy forces advancing from the west. Supported by 75-millimeter guns on half-tracks, the Marines were able to slowly push the Japanese back. In view of enemy strength, the 1st Raider Battalion was called forward, and a coordinated attack pushed the enemy into a pocket along the river. Torrential rain on October 8th postponed the main attack, but at 18:30, action flared again near the river's mouth when the Japanese attempted to break out of their pocket. The brunt of the attack was borne by the Raiders, who suffered 34 casualties, but very few Japanese succeeded in escaping. Next day, 2 battalions of the 7th under Puller and Hannikin and a battalion from the 2nd Marines, reinforced by whaling scouts, crossed the Matanikau. They were to occupy the high ground west of the river and push north before turning east to pass through the 5th Marines at the mouth of the river. Whaling's group moved rapidly along the ridgeline west of the river and reached the sea before noon. Hannikin's 2nd Battalion 7th Marines kept pace along a parallel ridge. Puller's battalion protected the left flank. Marching toward Point Cruz, scouts caught sight of the Japanese 4th Infantry Regiment camped in a deep ravine. Puller called for artillery support, and using all available weapons, his men poured a deadly fire down on the trapped Japanese. Only after expending his available ammunition did Puller withdraw, leaving behind nearly 700 dead Japanese. For the Japanese, the loss of the line on the Matanikau was devastating, since the assembly and artillery positions on its east bank were the crux of the operations plan for the October offensive. Frustrated by continued failures, Lieutenant General Horiyoshi Hyakutake, commander of the 17th Army, arrived to personally supervise the operation. He could not believe that any terrain or any enemy could deter Japanese soldiers, and announced the attack would proceed as planned. One unavoidable factor for both the Americans and the Japanese in their struggle to gain supremacy on Guadalcanal was that they were operating at the absolute end of their supply lines. While the Japanese were geographically closer, their logistical problems were no less significant than those faced by the Americans. Further complicating matters for the Japanese was a military hierarchy that both in its structure and its attitude prevented the smooth flow of men and supplies to the island. American commanders were not immune to inter-service rivalries, yet as the fighting entered its third month, the importance of the campaign for Guadalcanal began to crystallize for both sides. Japanese plans in New Guinea were curtailed and soldiers rerouted to Guadalcanal, as were Americans set to seize the Santa Cruz Islands. On October 9th, the U.S. Army's 164th Infantry Regiment sailed from Noumea. The convoy was supported by most of the available naval strength in the South Pacific. Rear Admiral Norman Scott's Task Force 64 of 4 cruisers and 5 destroyers drew the job of covering the convoy's movement as it approached Guadalcanal. On October 11th, aerial reconnaissance reported a Japanese force 100 miles north of Cape Esperance. Scott calculated that the enemy should appear west of Savo around midnight, and he was determined to be there first. Unable to match the night tactics of his adversaries, Scott chose a line-ahead formation with destroyers positioned ahead and astern of his cruisers. They were to illuminate targets with searchlights after radar contact, discharge torpedoes at large vessels, and engage smaller targets with gunfire. Cruisers had orders to open fire as soon as the target was acquired.
Radar has been in use in the American Navy since before the war began. However, it's a new technology, and it's still not really understood or even trusted by the commanders in the field. And the approaching Japanese fleet is detected by radar, but that bearing is in contrast to one that has been received from a scout aircraft. So Scott, not knowing exactly which way to go, makes a 180-degree turn to put himself between those two contact reports, and in doing that, he unwittingly is crossing the Japanese T with the fleet.
Led by the flagship Aoba and Rear Admiral Goto, the bombardment force steamed directly toward the Americans at over 30 knots. As Navy guns swung into position to rake the approaching enemy column, the range dropped below 5,000 yards. At 23:46, cruiser Helena's 15-gun main battery opened up and quickly found the range. Salt Lake City and Boise joined in, and the Japanese flagship was hit hard. The first salvos smashed her superstructure and flag bridge, and Admiral Goto was mortally wounded. Other ships in Goto's force executed turns to clear the area, but Furutaka and Fubuki were not so fortunate. The Americans opened up, and the hapless ships were buried in an avalanche of fire. Scott's force was punished by return fire as the light of gun flashes betrayed positions. Boise sustained a pair of 8-inch hits that detonated the main magazine. Nearly 100 men died in the resulting firestorm. When the American fleet executed its turnabout, the lead destroyers had fallen out of formation, and when firing commenced, they were between the Japanese and American main bodies. While Laffey was able to extricate herself, Duncan and Fahrenholt were not so fortunate. Fahrenholt took a 6-inch shell from an American gun, but was able to successfully withdraw, while Duncan was heavily hit by both American and Japanese shells and eventually sank. With his formation in disarray, Scott ordered a retirement shortly after midnight. The Battle of Cape Esperance was over. Duncan had been lost and Boise badly damaged, but some measure of vengeance had been gained for the defeat at Savo. Material Japanese losses totaled 1 heavy cruiser and 3 destroyers and more than 550 men. More importantly, it shook Japanese confidence in their night fighting ability and made it clear that they no longer owned the slot. As October passed its midpoint, the American supply situation had become critical.
We were running out of food. We had the crews out scrounging the brush for ammunition that had been dropped and needed to be retrieved because we were running short of everything.
Running short of options was Admiral Nimitz, who had practically exhausted the material assistance he could provide. Recognizing that leadership in the South Pacific area had been lacking, Nimitz replaced Admiral Gormley with Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, a man Nimitz could count on to take instantaneous action with available forces. With his country locked in combat with a relentless enemy, Halsey was in his element. During the first 3 weeks of October, the Tokyo Express was able to swell the Japanese presence on the island to approximately 14,000.
The Japanese Army and the Navy, in a rare display of serious inter-service cooperation instead of rivalry, mounted a multi-phased attack on Guadalcanal. This was a genuinely serious effort to throw the Americans off the island and end the Allied threat to their southern flank.
The Japanese scheme provided for attacks on the American perimeter at 3 points. General Sumiyoshi was to distract American attention to the coastal corridor, while General Maruyama led the Sendai Division, 7,000 men, on a jungle march to attack from the south. An amphibious assault at Coley Point was to provide the coup de grace. The attack was to commence on October 22nd, but the jungle stymied the movement of Maruyama's force. With no equipment to clear the way, the Sendai was forced to hack its way through. With each man carrying ammunition, an artillery shell, and some rations, the column inched along the trail. Disassembled artillery pieces lagged farther and farther behind. Maruyama considered his difficulties and postponed the attack 24 hours. The next day, he pushed the date back to the 24th.
American commanders have a captured Japanese map that details the three-pronged attack, but other than that, they have really no hard intelligence. Their ground and aerial patrols have turned up no Japanese activity except on the Matanikau. And so it seems logical to the commanders that the map may be a ruse, and that they begin then to focus all their efforts at the Matanikau, and the Japanese do everything they can to draw American attention to that front.
Omens for an attack along the coast were offered up in the form of increased artillery fire directed mainly at Henderson. Infantry-supported tanks were sent out, and finally, shelling was redirected toward the east bank of the Matanikau. Had communications between Japanese units not broken down, the feint may have worked to perfection. However, General Sumiyoshi was unaware of Maruyama's second postponement, and on the evening of the 23rd, his forces attacked. Elements of the 4th Infantry, accompanied by tanks, struck at the Americans, but 10 Marine artillery battalions had registered their guns on the mouth of the Matanikau and the coastal track behind it. Over 6,000 rounds crushed the infantry attack, and anti-tank weapons destroyed most of the advancing tanks. The Japanese suffered heavy casualties and scarcely made a scratch in the Marine line. The attack confirmed the belief that the major assault would come from the west, and Colonel Hannikin's battalion was pulled out of the line south of the airfield and redeployed, leaving Chesty Puller's battalion to defend a 2,500-yard front. By October 24th, Maruyama's force had reached its assembly area south of Henderson. Exhausted by their 6-day trek, they prepared to mount an attack supported by little more than unyielding devotion to their emperor. Artillery pieces and mortars had been mostly abandoned, making machine guns their most formidable weapons. As the Japanese began working their way toward final jump-off points, the jungle continued to wreak havoc on their assault plan. Units lost their way or became separated, and when the attack was finally launched, it came off piecemeal and lacked coordination. The Sendai lurched toward the Americans, with the leading elements reaching the Marine line about 2,200. Skirmishes began to flare up along the perimeter, and by 0130, Puller recognized that a major attack was in progress. Puller requested reinforcement, and the 3rd Battalion, 164th Infantry, was sent to link up with the Marines. The situation dictated that the soldiers be intermingled with Marines along the front lines, and together they successfully halted the Japanese attack. During the night, a small salient was established in the center of Puller's line, but the toehold was quickly eradicated. An erroneous report to Tokyo suggested that the Marines were teetering on the edge of defeat, and Fleet Headquarters believed a naval bombardment might push them over. Japanese naval and air units were dispatched to Guadalcanal to provide the blow and also to cover the amphibious landing at Coley Point.
And they were bombing along the runway, and by the time it was over, they ran out of bombs, fortunately, a quarter of a mile from us, but by the time it was over, I was just shaking so bad that one of the guys gave me a cigarette, and it really calmed my nerves down, and I've been smoking the damn things ever since. So someday I'm going to sue the Marine Corps for starting me smoking.
Although most Americans spent the day below ground on Dugout Sunday, the Cactus Air Force met the Japanese with a vengeance. Wildcats continuously roared off, engaged flights of Zeros and bombers, landed, rearmed, refueled, and took off again, and in the process claimed 12 enemy planes. SBDs engaged the surface fleet, sinking one light cruiser and damaging 2 destroyers.
My respect for the real heroes of those early days in the Solomon Islands were the flyers. Those guys would come back, and every day some of them didn't come back. And the guy would get out of bed the next morning and get back and go and do it again. And I don't think the people in the United States don't understand what that group of people did. Every day they got up and went back.
While air and naval forces held center stage, ground commanders on both sides reassessed the situation. Puller and Hall's battalions were separated and redeployed, with the Division Reserve stationed just behind them. Counting on better coordination, the Japanese battle plan was virtually unchanged.
The Japanese were so confident that it was going to work that they launched a major fighter sweep from Rabaul, which was to orbit Henderson Field and wait for a prearranged signal from the Japanese army on the ground saying that it was all right to come on down to land.
That night, Maruyama's 16th and 29th Infantry Regiments again attacked the southern perimeter. Without artillery preparation or knowledge of the enemy's position, placing faith in spiritual power over firepower, the Sendai rushed to their destruction.
We had a line of defense set up with crossfires arranged, that whole works. And the guys back in the trees would holler and say they're coming through the wire at such and such a spot. So they would set their machine guns and everything to saturate that particular entry through the wire. And there was a lot of Japanese killed there.
At 0300, Colonel Oka's forces attacked Hannikin's battalion on a ridge east of the Matanikau. The Marines on the left were forced to fall back, but before the Japanese could consolidate their position, a hastily collected group that included runners and cooks launched a counterattack, and after a short, vicious fight, Oka's men were forced to withdraw. The Japanese land offensive of late October failed for many reasons, not the least of which was the skill and determination with which the Americans fought. Equally accountable, though, was the Japanese command's tactical inflexibility. Rather than drawing from the failures of Ichiki and Kawaguchi, they arrogantly went forward with a plan that broke down for many of the same reasons. That Vandegrift and his staff benefited from Japanese inflexibility is undeniable, but it does not diminish the brilliance with which they met this most critical phase of the campaign. Admiral Yamamoto had deployed his Guadalcanal support force 300 miles north of the island to destroy American forces attempting to flee in the aftermath of the 17th Army's victory. This, however, had not come to pass, and Admiral Halsey, hoping to provide an exclamation point to the American victory ashore, ordered Hornet and Enterprise north to engage the enemy. The Japanese surface force outnumbered the Americans by a ratio of more than 2 to 1, but the evolution of naval warfare had made another factor much more important. 4 Imperial carriers would match 212 planes against 2 American carriers supporting just 136. As in all the previous carrier engagements, finding the opponent was task number 1.
In the U.S. Navy, the basic scouting unit for a carrier air group was 2 aircraft, almost always 2 SBDs, but later sometimes operating mixed sections with 1 Dauntless and 1 Avenger. But they would fly a wedge-shaped sector, perhaps 150 to 200 nautical miles out, about a 50-mile cross leg, and then the equivalent distance back to what they call point option. The trouble is, you're not leaving from an airport. You're leaving from a ship that can move as much as 30 knots. So if you're flying perhaps a 2-hour mission or a 3-hour mission, the ship could be quite a ways from your launch position, and that's the reason that naval aviators were required to be such expert navigators. So navigation was extremely important to it, and also communications. It doesn't do you much good to find the enemy if you can't tell your base where they're located. The most reliable type of radio communication was CW, continuous wave, which required the use of Morse code. It was longer ranged and more reliable than voice radio. And that's the reason that the enlisted man sitting in the back of every SBD was cross-trained. Whether his rating was as an ordnanceman or a radioman, he was equally proficient in aviation weapons, especially machine guns for defense of the aircraft, and in radio, not only sending and receiving Morse code, but maintaining and repairing the radios. So just because an individual is sitting in the back of the bus looking where he's been rather than where he's going does not mean that he's any less a part of the reconnaissance team than the pilot. He's very much a full partner.
The opposing forces spent the night of October 25th, 26th zigzagging as their patrol planes diligently searched. One Japanese force was located at about 0300, but the report failed to reach the American carriers until daybreak. When a Japanese reconnaissance plane was sighted shortly thereafter, any possible advantage was lost. Before receiving the report, Enterprise sent 16 SBDs to search for the enemy.
Naval aviators were intensively trained in overwater navigation, and by and large, they did a superb job of it. There was one episode of superb navigation on the part of U.S. scout bombers that occurred from the Enterprise Air Group, which allowed a 2-plane section to navigate from their own assigned search sector to another sector approximately 80 to 100 miles away, accurately and quickly find the Japanese carriers and deliver an effective dive bombing attack, and they got away clean.
One SBD sent a 500-pound bomb crashing into the light carrier Zuiho. Unable to launch or receive aircraft, she was forced to retire. Shortly after 0900, the Japanese fell upon Hornet. Assailed by anti-aircraft fire, the dive bombers came in first. The starboard side of the flight deck was struck, and then 2 near misses rocked the ship. Next, a Val, crippled by anti-aircraft fire, crashed through the stack and then the flight deck, where its bombs detonated. Then the Kates came in, skimming in low to avoid anti-aircraft fire, and they sent 2 torpedoes into the engine room. Hornet lurched to a stop as 2 more 500-pound bombs struck aft and a third slightly forward. In 5 minutes, Hornet had become a blazing, drifting hulk. Initially, efforts to save her looked promising, but the inability to repair her engines sealed her fate. In the late afternoon, a half-dozen Kates caught the carrier plodding along at 3 knots and launched torpedoes. Only one hit, but one was enough. 200 miles to the northwest, Hornet's dive bombers found Shokaku.
The SBD had a rear gunner for a very good reason. A dive bomber squadron would fly a stepped down echelon which unmasked the rear guns in each airplane so that they had a clear field of fire, at least on the horizontal and the vertical plane, without having to be concerned about shooting low into any of the other friendly aircraft. And that arrangement did work. The Hornet SBDs fought a running gun battle inbound to the Shokaku, and they lost, I think, 3, perhaps 4 SBDs, but were able to keep the Zeros at bay long enough to reach the pushover point and successfully put their bombs on the target.
Struck by several thousand-pound bombs, Shokaku was forced to turn away. At about 1100, Admiral Kinkaid's Enterprise group came under attack when Japanese Vals began dropping out of the sky. Anti-aircraft fire from Enterprise and her screen claimed numerous enemy aircraft, but several bombs scored hits on the Big E, the most serious jamming her forward elevator. Torpedo planes then mounted a savage attack, and only superior maneuvering saved Enterprise, as 3 times she narrowly avoided torpedoes. More bombing attacks followed, but anti-aircraft fire again limited the enemy's success. By 1400, the Enterprise group had retired hastily to the south.
The Big E was able to limp away, absolutely chock-a-block with airplanes from her own air group and from Hornets. And one of the classic examples of landing signal officer importance occurred when Lieutenant Robin Lindsay, who was the senior LSO aboard Enterprise, told his talker to pull the phone jack out of the socket when the ship's captain ordered him to stop landing airplanes. And Robin did a brilliant job because a bomb hit had stuck the Enterprise's rear elevator in the full down position. So a pilot approaching the deck sees a huge black hole in the middle of the deck, and Robin was able to, as they say, cut each airplane onto the number 1 wire. Otherwise, it would have gone down the elevator shaft and probably had a fatal accident.
The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, the 4th carrier battle in 6 months, was a tactical victory for the Japanese, measured in tonnage sunk. Hornet was gone and Enterprise was out of the fight. But the cost was extremely high. The Japanese had lost the services of 2 carriers, and nearly 100 aircraft were total losses. Japan lost more pilots at Santa Cruz than it had at Midway, suffering a staggering 34% loss ratio.
As Coral Sea affected the outcome at Midway, so did Midway affect the outcome at Guadalcanal. They lost the cream of their naval aviation at Midway and Guadalcanal and simply never recovered it. I've had the occasion to get to know Saburo Sakai, who was the top living Japanese fighter ace to survive the war. And he makes the point that pilots or pilot trainees who were thrown out of training before the war were far better than some of those who actually went to combat flying Japanese Navy aircraft just a couple of years later. So the huge attrition that Japanese naval aviation sustained in concert at Midway and Guadalcanal was such that they never had any hope of recovering within the rest of the war.
The physical shape in which General Vandegrift found his men after their battle with the Sendai was not encouraging. 3 months of uninterrupted ordeal, such as no American troops before or since had endured, had taken its toll. They had come to Guadalcanal muscular and high-spirited young men, but as the weeks stretched into months, exhaustion became a foe nearly as formidable as the Japanese. Malaria had become an increasing problem since the Marines had arrived on Guadalcanal, and by the end of November, more than 5,500 cases had been diagnosed.
They had Atabrine, kind of a yellow pill, and a lot of the guys wouldn't take it because they were I know somebody started a rumor that it made you impotent and you'd turn yellow, and in fact you did turn kind of yellow, but I don't know that there were any other ill effects. I took mine. It's not my fault that I got malaria. I tried.
My late great friend Marion Carl, who had a steel constitution, was able to thrive in that environment, but he estimated when we were writing his autobiography that in the long term being perhaps 2 or 3 months, only about 1 aviator in 4 really retained his combat efficiency. And that combined with casualties and the increasing attrition from illness meant a constantly descending spiral that just ate up squadrons rotating through Guadalcanal for those 6 months. It's not at all certain we could have sustained it very much longer beyond that.
General Vandergrift knew the Japanese were suffering too, and he planned to attack before they could consolidate near the Matanikau again. The 5th Marines, supported on the inland flank by whaling scouts, would attack west on November 1st along a 1,500-yard front. Preceded by an intense artillery bombardment and supported by airstrikes from B-17s, the 5th Marines crossed 3 bridges constructed by the 1st Engineer Battalion and fanned out with the 1st Battalion along the coast and the 2nd Battalion and Whalings Group farther inland. The 2nd Battalion and Whalings Group encountered little resistance, but machine gun and light artillery fire halted the 1st Battalion. When the Marines successfully compressed the Japanese into a draw between the coastal trail and the beach west of Point Cruz, it resulted in cave fighting reminiscent of Tulagi. But this 3rd attempt to clear the western flank was interrupted by events in the east. Radio intelligence indicated Japanese reinforcements were to arrive east of Coley Point, and Hannikin's 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, drew the assignment of checking this new enemy threat. After a 12-hour march on November 2nd, Hannikin forded the Metapona River east of Coley Point and set up to receive visitors. The following morning, Hannikin ranged his mortars on the landing beaches, but when this elicited no immediate response, he resolved to attack. As he began to organize his men, several hundred Japanese began to advance toward his line. Unable to notify headquarters of his situation due to radio failure, Hannikin decided to withdraw. He pulled back to the west bank of the Nalimbu, where he had communications wire connecting him with the perimeter.
The radios had a battery pack in them. If the batteries got wet, they just didn't function. It was not a usable piece of equipment, given the weather conditions in the South Pacific, the humidity and the rain and the whole works. They just wouldn't function. So the communication then became by telephone. We were climbing the trees, laying the lines, and of course you did that. You laid yourself wide open to sniper fire or anything else. It was like a crap game. Who's going to climb that tree and who's going to haul that wire up?
Shortly after the message was received, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines was sent by boat to reinforce its embattled sister unit. 2 tank companies prepared to move east, and the 164th Infantry fell in to march on an inland route to the Nalimbu. In the interval, a small naval force shelled the Japanese and airstrikes were sent in. Unfortunately, errant bombs added American casualties to those inflicted on the Japanese. While American forces were converging in the east and mopping up continued in the west, a supply convoy bearing the 8th Marines and 2 155mm gun batteries dropped anchor off Lunga Point. The 155s provided for the first time effective counter-battery fire. Over the next 2 days, the 155s and numerous airstrikes assaulted the Japanese at Gavaga Creek. The systematic attack left 450 Japanese dead, but 3,000 men were able to escape. Hungry and exhausted, they faced the daunting task of retracing their march to the Matanikau. With the eastern threat contained, Vandegrift deployed his forces to resume operations in the west. But on November 11th, an ominous message was received from Admiral Halsey. Radio intelligence had determined that a great fleet had sailed from Truk. Later that day, 2 furious air raids underlined Halsey's warning. The Japanese had finally reached 2 undeniable conclusions. The American presence on Guadalcanal was far greater than originally estimated, and that any hope of ejecting them lay in the destruction of Henderson Field. Consequently, the Japanese assembled a large convoy of merchant vessels loaded with enough supplies and ammunition for a month's worth of fighting, and ensured its safe arrival by attaching a powerful covering force. According to the plan, Henderson Field would be shelled into impotence on Z-Day -1. The transports could thus unload without the danger of air attack. Imperial headquarters in Tokyo had at last reached a consensus. Guadalcanal was the decisive battle between Japan and the United States.
The climax of the Guadalcanal campaign occurred in the middle of November, with the last major effort on the part of the Japanese to reinforce their garrison on the island. By that point, the Japanese saw the way the campaign was going, and the large majority of the troops who were still on the island were in no condition to carry on. They were disease-ridden. Hundreds and thousands of them eventually starved to death. So reinforcement was absolutely vital if the Japanese were to retrieve the situation.
On the eve of this massive Japanese effort, Admiral Turner ran 2 separate groups of transports to Guadalcanal. Turner dispatched Rear Admiral Norman Scott to accompany one group and Admiral Daniel Callahan to escort the other. Early light on November 12th revealed the transports and their escort lying safely off Lunga Point. 5,500 replacements came ashore, among them the 182nd Infantry Division. Rabaul soon learned of the transport's presence, and at 1400, 16 torpedo-armed bombers materialized over Guadalcanal. The entire attack lasted 8 minutes, but 16 planes fell, including 4 American and 1 pilot. These losses were made up later that day when the first P-38s arrived, giving the Cactus Air Force 77 operational planes.
The thing that most people don't realize about operating from Henderson Field in those months of 1942 is how close run a thing it was. There were a couple of occasions where only 1 SBD was airworthy on the entire island. There were times when you had 3 or 4 times as many pilots as available airplanes. It was a meat grinder, and the case has been made that despite all the battles that came before and after Guadalcanal, that campaign was the one which really defined the way the war was going to go, because it involved the type of attrition warfare that a small island nation such as Japan simply could not hope to win.
The enemy task force was sighted steaming toward Guadalcanal prior to noon on the 12th, and Turner surmised that the Japanese intended to either attack his transports as they withdrew or bombard Henderson. To his credit, Turner continued unloading operations until late in the day, then withdrew with only a nominal screen, leaving 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers behind to engage the Japanese. Admiral Callahan, whom Turner left in command, was faced with an urgent situation, but he had neither the experience nor the training for the mission he had received. After seeing the transport safely away, he organized his ships into a line-ahead formation and awaited the Japanese. As Callahan's ships patrolled the waters off Guadalcanal, they had been issued no specific instructions for the coming battle, and few had ever operated together before that afternoon. The crews of these ships had been at sea now for many months, and as the men peered from darkened bridges, waited in crowded plotting rooms, or sweated in stifling engine rooms, the strain was clearly visible. Early on the 13th, the Japanese bombardment force entered Iron Bottom Sound, built around battleships Hai and Kirishima. Confident that there were no American warships present, hundreds of bombardment projectiles were stacked around the 14-inch turrets. Callahan's task force approached the Japanese at 20 knots on nearly a reciprocal course. Well after the van destroyers, cruiser Helena's effective SG radar first detected the enemy at 0124 at a range of 27,000 yards. This picture was not clear to Callahan, whose choice of flagship denied him the use of SG radar. At 0141, the leading Japanese and American destroyers sighted each other, and within minutes, the entire Japanese force knew of the contact. Confusion reigned as the range between the leading elements decreased to a ludicrous 1,000 yards. Whether by fate or through tactical blunders, Callahan had brought on a point-blank brawl of monstrous proportions. At 0148, 24 minutes after Helena positively identified enemy ships closing the range, Callahan issued the order, "Stand by to open fire." Ships opened fire from all directions, and the battle soon degenerated into individual ship-to-ship actions. In the confusion, both sides fired on their own ships.
What happened was that they were in columns, American, Japanese, and American. And the Japanese would turn the searchlight on, and the destroyer that turned it on would just blow up. You could watch shells going down, and some of those armor-piercing shells would go right through a ship and come out the other side. You could see them. And ships were immediately on fire all over the place. They must have been, I don't know, 15 or 20 ships out there firing at each other. And our star shells would go up and illuminate the whole thing, and the Japs would turn searchlights on a target. And then I saw this cruiser, light cruiser, blow up. They must have hit their magazines below that turret. It was a column of fire went up like this, huge columns, and in it I could see this turret just turning over and over, going up.
On shore, the men gathered to watch this awesome melee.
One of them would fire a broadside and it looked like a flock of quail taking off. And then a ship would blow up and light up the whole sky, and it was just a fearsome battle. And the next morning, I think it was the Atlanta, was just not too far offshore, and it looked just fine until you look through binoculars. There's just holes all along the side, and the whole bridge was just blown off, just as clean as if it had been cut off with a cutting torch. And the San Francisco, the heavy cruiser, was out over towards Savo, dead in the water. And if you got glasses, the whole fantail for maybe 50, 75 feet was just blown off clear down to the waterline. And I think that was Admiral Callahan that was on the bridge that was killed there. But there was also a Japanese battleship out on the horizon that was smoking up a storm, and the planes were just back and forth, the dive bombers particularly.
The Americans on Guadalcanal were treated to a sight they had never seen or perhaps even imagined. There was a huge Japanese battleship, the Hai, steaming slowly in circles. She had been badly damaged during the surface engagement during the night, and this was simply the big rock Candy Mountain to the Marines who had been on the receiving end of so much horrific naval bombardment over the previous few months. And the Enterprise, being the only carrier still in the area, sent succession of shuttle missions. Her dive bombers and torpedo planes would attack Hai, land ashore at Henderson Field, rearm, refuel, go back out again, perhaps with their same squadron mates, perhaps with people they had never seen before. And throughout the length of the day, Army, Navy, and Marine Corps air crews gradually wore down that battleship, and she became the first battleship ever sunk by air power by the United States Navy. And as such, it was a significant achievement.
When the battle was over, Admirals Callahan and Scott were dead, as were more than 750 American sailors. Of the 13 American ships involved, only one escaped damage. Barton blew up, Monson sank, Cushing and Laffey were lost, as were the cruisers Atlanta and Juno, the latter finished off by a Japanese submarine as she tried to stagger home after battle, carrying another 700 men to the bottom. Among them were 5 brothers, the Sullivans, who had insisted on serving together despite opposition from their superiors. The loss of Juno and her crew brought total American losses in the aftermath of the naval battle of Guadalcanal to more than 1,400. Halsey sensed that the Japanese had been only temporarily deflected, and he ordered Admiral Kinkaid on Enterprise to detach a segment of his covering force to prevent further Japanese incursions. This hastily formed group sailed immediately for Iron Bottom Sound, but it was too far south to prevent another night bombardment. At 01:30 on November 14th, 3 Japanese cruisers commenced a 30-minute bombardment. PT boats from Tulagi contested, but did not severely hamper their efforts.
We fired 2 torpedoes at them. I don't know how the other boats fired, but we fired 2. Those old torpedoes had tubes and a gun. A 3-inch cartridge was in an exploder up above. You could even fire them on a hand, or the guy could push a button in the bridge and fire them. The time we fired our torpedoes and turned around and started running, I could see the boat next to us. And a salvo of shells came over, and you see them, they just floated over and they landed right around it. None of them hit it, they were just all around it and exploded in the water and knocked everybody on the board flat. But it kept going, and then by then we didn't see any more, but you could see the flashes of the guns of the cans off in the distance. So I don't know whether we hit anything or not, but we sure must have shaken them up a bit.
Fortunately for the Americans, the shelling missed Henderson completely and caused only minimal damage to Fighter 1. As the Japanese retired up the slot, planes from both Henderson and Enterprise furiously attacked them. 1 ship was sunk and 3 others badly damaged, but almost at once the cruiser force became of secondary importance. The bombardment by the cruisers had been carried out to allow a large daylight supply run on the 14th, and believing the mission had been a success, Admiral Raizo Tanaka's convoy approached Guadalcanal. But at 08:30, the convoy was discovered and attacked by scout bombers from Enterprise, a prelude to a murderous sequence of air attacks by aircraft from Henderson and Enterprise, and even B-17s from Noumea.
The Navy and Marine Corps, and to a lesser extent the Army air crews on Guadalcanal, established almost a shuttle service flying out and back, that they came to call the Buzzard Brigade. It got its name from the rather grisly aspects from what was visible on the decks of the Japanese ships. If you talk to some of the Navy and Marine pilots who were there, they will tell you of literally seeing the decks run red. The Japanese troops were tightly packed above decks for quick disembarkation, and one Wildcat with 650 calibers could just churn up a horrific mass in a densely packed area like that.
Just 36 sorties were flown in defense of the beleaguered convoy, an indication of just how far downhill the fleet air arm had gone.
At the rate we were getting rid of those fighter planes, and the bombers without cover were very vulnerable. Our fighter pilots, with their 50 calibers, they were knocking them out of the air just to beat hell.
By the time darkness mercifully fell on the convoy, 7 of Tanaka's 11 transports had been sunk. Meanwhile, Rear Admiral Willis Lee with battleships South Dakota and Washington and their screen of 4 destroyers arrived off Savo Island.
It was nighttime as we passed Savo Island. It was a beautiful night and aromatic. There were some flowers blooming on shore. I don't know what they were, but it was a very sweet aroma. And at the time, there wasn't any moon out that I remember. It was very dark.
We got word from Cactus Control that there were 75 Jap warships and 3 different task forces coming down. And our instructions were to slip through the first wave of warships and attack the transports behind them. And our skipper says, bullshit. First thing we hit, see we're going to hit. So we lined up in a row and we were going along towards the north there. And we looked up and here was a row of warships on the horizon coming in. And so our skipper called, I was right next to him, I could hear him. He called Cactus Control and he says, we have targets, we have ships coming in. He gave their course and their speed, and we were going to attack. And then another voice came on the radio and said, this is Ching Chong Lee. You get your PT boats out of here, you're in I have you on my radar. It was Admiral Lee and a battleship South Dakota and Washington and a group of destroyers. So we went back then and just patrolled back and forth off our base.
Lee faced many of the same problems that confronted Callahan, an outnumbered force that had operated as a group for less than 2 days, operating in confined waters against an enemy unmatched in night fighting. However, Lee did have something that Callahan did not, a flagship with SG radar and a full appreciation of its use. By nightfall on November 14th, Admiral Nobutake Kondo was approaching Guadalcanal. His force of 14 warships was built around the battleship Kirishima. As early as 2200, keen-eyed Japanese lookouts had detected the distant silhouettes of hostile ships, but the disposition of this force was uncertain and was believed to consist of destroyers and new-type cruisers, a notion that was soon to be disproved.
These ships went around behind Savo, and then another group came on behind them. So our skipper called in, he could see them, and he called in and asked Admiral Lee, says, you have, he gave a course and speed to the ships he saw and said, you have friends behind you, and Admiral Lee came back on the radio and says, I have no friends. And about then, all hell broke loose.
As usual, the Japanese began by firing their deadly long-lance torpedoes, and as usual, they hit their targets. Steelfish sunk the destroyers Walk and Preston and crippled Benham in the opening moments. Only Gwynn escaped the torpedo attack, but gunfire soon drove her from the battle.
First I could see the fire, and then I realized as we got closer to it that it was, these were ships that were burning. And as we steamed through them, or close by the ships, I could hear them. They were Americans. Destroyers have a short life.
2 miles to the rear of the American destroyers, South Dakota was repeatedly losing power due to faulty electrical equipment.
The ship was hit 41 times, which is a whole lot more than I was aware of at the time. But I was aware that there was a whole lot of damage going on in the ship's superstructure. We had no electricity. We lost all power in the middle of a battle. You haven't got any power, you feel helpless, and we did.
While South Dakota drew the bulk of the attention, Washington approached to within 8,500 yards of the Japanese undetected. Taking Kirishima under fire, she quickly buried the battleship under an avalanche of fire, scoring 9 16-inch direct hits and more than 35 5-inch hits.
Big battleship guns and the cruisers and destroyers started shooting and shelling. And you'd watch their 16-inch shells in the clusters of 9 sail up over the horizon and disappeared, and the ship would start burning up there. You could see ships burning and exploding. And then one ship came back at high speed. And of course, we had no way to tell who it was. But when he got opposite us, he just turned and headed north. So we knew it was a Jap, but he was nothing we could do then. Our torpedoes wouldn't have caught him.
While South Dakota retired, Washington proceeded to sink Ayanami and then began to gradually disengage from the action. The bombardment fleet had once again been turned back, but in spite of this fact, Kondo ordered Tanaka to proceed with his transports to Tassafaronga. To make sure of getting the troops ashore, Tanaka ordered the transports to beach themselves. All four were destroyed later that day under the weight of unrelenting air attacks from Henderson and Enterprise. The net gain to the 17th Army was 2,000 troops and a handful of supplies in return for the annihilation of an entire transport fleet. For the Japanese, their defeat in the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal ended any hope of wresting the island from the Americans. In the course of 3 days' heavy fighting in and around the area, they had lost 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, 11 combat transports, and the majority of the men and supplies they were to deliver. In spite of heavy losses, the United States had gained the upper hand in the campaign, and the victory signaled the beginning of the end for the Japanese in the Solomons. Control of the sea and air had passed to the United States. The naval victory, coupled with the arrival of the 182nd Infantry, allowed the renewal of the offensive toward Kokumbona. The Americans met and clashed with Japanese units on the 19th, and for the next 5 days, the opposing forces fought what ended as a standoff. The troops were ordered to dig in, and the westward offensive had to be suspended until reinforcements could be brought in. The stalemate would last for over 6 weeks. After the naval battle of Guadalcanal, Tanaka's destroyers still made frequent supply runs to the island, one of which led to the last major naval battle of the campaign. On November 30th, a dramatically superior force of U.S. ships suffered another humiliating defeat in the Battle of Tassafaronga. The end result was 1 U.S. heavy cruiser sunk and 3 more incapacitated in exchange for 1 Japanese destroyer.
After that battle, we came in. One of the cruisers, the New Orleans, she'd taken a torpedo up forward, and the whole forward end of the thing was gone. From the number 1 turret was gone forward. And they brought her in and took her back up in the bushes there where our tender was, and shored up the hold in front. They used coconut logs, and you wouldn't believe the Limey's charged of $75 a tree for the coconut trees they cut to shore up the front so she could get back to the base and get a new bow built. I guess she wound up in Pearl Harbor and they rebuilt the bow.
The defeat at Tassafaronga led to much discussion in the Pacific Fleet about tactical doctrine, and new methods emerged that would be put into effect later in the war. Eventually, the U.S. Pacific Fleet would establish superiority over its enemy in most aspects of naval warfare. Although the campaign for Guadalcanal was far from over for the 1st Marine Division, December brought with it a long-awaited event. After nearly 4 months of intermittent combat, air raids, and naval attacks, the worn-out division was to be relieved, with the 1st echelon leaving in early December. The U.S. Army Americal Division's 132nd Infantry arrived at Lunga on December 8th, and the next day, Vandegrift turned over command of American forces on Guadalcanal to Major General Alexander Patch.
When they finally took us off, we had been occupying the position on the Matanikau for quite some time, and I think we were down to 40% or less effective, just from malaria and jungle rot and dysentery and you name it, we had it. But the thing that really was kind of pitiful was seeing those guys trying to climb those cargo nets to get back on the ship. 'Cause they just weren't in shape that they could climb them. And so the sailors were coming down the nets and helping, and eventually we got everybody on the ship, but it was a struggle, and it was kind of sad because it was a good group.
After the defeat at Henderson in late October, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal had been forced into defensive positions in the area of Mount Austin. With the arrival of fresh troops swelling the American ranks on Guadalcanal, it was time to take decisive offensive action against the Japanese remaining on the island. Some 6 miles southwest of Henderson, Mount Austin represented a threat to the flank of any drive to the west. The attack to take this position began on December 17th, and the Americans soon discovered the difficulties that had doomed Japanese efforts.
As they move into the attacks on the Gifu and the other fortified positions, the weather's atrocious, causes constant problems. The terrain is also a constant handicap. They can't coordinate their attacks beyond the small unit levels. You can't see, you can't coordinate, supply is a problem. This attack will go on, it'll grind on, it'll be a brutal close-in contest until the 23rd of January, when tanks and infantry will finally break into the last fortified positions and eliminate the Japanese defenders.
Since the defeat of the transports in November, the supply situation for the Japanese had grown increasingly dismal. Rations had fallen to 1/6 for men in the front line and 1/10 for all others. With the situation finally deemed irretrievable by Premier Tojo and the Army High Command, the evacuation of Guadalcanal was ordered. The resultant accumulation of shipping indicated to American commanders renewed Japanese operations in the southern Solomons. To counter this perceived threat, a task force was dispatched to patrol the waters south of Guadalcanal. On January 29th and 30th, long-range Japanese aircraft were thrown against the American force. The heavy cruiser Chicago was lost in what became known as the Battle of Rennell Island. After the capture of Mount Austin, American forces on Guadalcanal had begun an undeviating advance through the area west of Point Cruz. By the 5th of February, the GIs had reached the Umasani River against only sporadic resistance.
General Patch realizes that the Japanese are apparently pulling out and trying to evacuate the island. And to preclude this effort, he's going to send the 2nd Battalion of the 132nd Infantry in a flanking amphibious assault to try and cut off the retreating Japanese. And they'll land in the area of Veracruz and begin to move back towards the oncoming Americans. And the effort will be to catch the Japanese between these pinchers.
The U.S. Navy attempted to halt Japanese evacuation efforts, yet more than 10,000 Japanese soldiers were successfully evacuated from Guadalcanal, men who would live to meet the Marines on other islands with even more infamous names. On February 9th, the island was declared officially secure.
One of the ironies of the Guadalcanal campaign is that the Japanese Navy, which for a period of some decades, at least 20-odd years, had been building its Pacific War strategy on the concept of the one decisive battle, did in fact get the one decisive battle, but it was not the one they expected. Had the Japanese won at Guadalcanal, had they forced an American withdrawal, there again, as with the situation that could have pertained after Midway, the Japanese would have had breathing space, but I don't think it would have changed the course of the war. By then, America's blood was up. The American public was entirely behind the endeavor, and it simply would have taken longer to get to Tokyo Bay than it did otherwise.
The American victory at Guadalcanal far exceeded the value of its undisputed possession. The campaign inflicted severe attrition on Japan's ground forces, where 2 out of every 3 men who set foot on the island perished. The Imperial fleet suffered significant losses among its light naval forces, yet it was Japan's loss of her highly skilled air crews which produced the most important long-term effect. Admiral Halsey later said of the campaign, "Before Guadalcanal, the enemy advanced at his pleasure. After Guadalcanal, he retreated at ours." For the men who served there more than half a century ago, time has only softened a deep bitterness.
The war in the Pacific was entirely different than the war over in Europe. The Japanese, they're more suicidal. I think that's what you would say. They don't value life like the Americans do. Strange. They're strange people. I used to hate them, but I guess I've got away from that.
This was really a kind of a personal type war. It wasn't a mass execution type war. It got down to a kind of a personal point. And I think an awful lot of people took it pretty personally, including me. And I still will not drive a Japanese car. I won't buy a Japanese product if there is any other similar or comparable product. And yet I have some Japanese friends who are wonderful people.
I don't particularly like them. I don't hate them anymore. When you're fighting them, you respect their ability, but you don't like them because they're savage warriors. They don't believe in surrendering. And those didn't. I think it's probably different now. It's shameful to lose, surrender. They'd rather die. They did by enormous numbers of them.
And while the Americans won the battle, few went away gloating with victory. For most, they took away something far more valuable.
It's an experience that I'm proud of. I wouldn't give it up for anything, and I sure as hell wouldn't go through it again for anything. But I think it helped me in my life.
Sometimes when you see an old CB or an old Marine that's my age, and you see us get together, you'll never understand why. And when we came back, we were determined that our sons and daughters would never experience that again.
An epitaph on the grave of one who remained perhaps best sums up the battle that was Guadalcanal. And when he goes to heaven, to St. Peter he will tell, "Another Marine reporting, sir. I've served my time in hell."
In the late 1930s, Japan extended its area of control on the Asian continent. To the south, the Emperor's troops concentrated their attacks on China's coastal cities. With the area bordering the sea conquered, Japanese troops sealed off China's armies in the interior most effectively. But Japan was well aware that China was not thoroughly blockaded as long as supplies from the outside world could be brought into Rangoon. thence transported by rail to northern Burma, finally across the mountains to China via the Burma Road. In July 1940, that supply line, too, was sealed off. In Tokyo, the British ambassador, Sir Robert Craigie, advised Japanese Foreign Minister Arita that Great Britain was closing the Burma Road, a move intended to appease Japan, while Britain was engaged in a life-or-death struggle in Europe and Africa. The vital lifeline to China was cut for 3 months. In October, the road was reopened by the British, whose policy in Asia was stiffening, and supplies were again unloaded in Burma for the long overland journey to central China. On that tortuous route depended China's hope for survival in the desperate struggle against the aggressors. By December 7th, 1941, the Japanese had succeeded in winning control of great areas of the Asian continent. On December 8th, Japanese troops in Asia went to work in earnest. One of their main objectives was Burma. Japanese troops quickly took possession of Lower Burma, where the British oil wells were located. Before pulling out, British forces had set fire to the oil fields, which fell into Japanese hands in mid-April 1942. The conquerors embarked at once on a program of winning over the Burmese to their own point of view. Speaking in Burmese, Japanese officers expounded the doctrine of Asia for the Asiatics. The natives in the areas already controlled by the Japanese were skeptical but curious. In the hills where Britain's Indian troops were in hiding, the Japanese were forced to go to a little more trouble to get their message across. Their propaganda was artfully introduced by authentic Indian music. But the invaders weren't relying wholly on propaganda to achieve their objectives. The Burma Road was one of their most important targets in those early months of 1942. On the ground, the Japanese were intent on driving north from their newly conquered territory to cut the Burma Road and completely isolate China. That ambitious plan called for Japanese troops to advance more than 500 miles over difficult terrain against an Allied belaying action. The Emperor's troops attacked with great determination. In late March, the invaders had seized Toungoo, routing Chinese forces commanded by U.S. General Vinegar Joe Stilwell. Thoroughly overpowered, the Allied forces retreated, followed closely by the Japanese, and finally reached Imphal in India just as the monsoon season began. Thus ended one of the most remarkable retreats in military history. Quantities of American munitions and equipment were seized by the enemy during the chase. In their conquest of Burma, the Japanese took a considerable number of British prisoners of war. British resistance in all of Southeast Asia was ended by May 1942. Throughout Asia, British prestige had dropped to a new low. With the Burma lifeline cut, a new route to China was devised, by way of India, thence by air across the towering Himalayas to beleaguered central China. Into Calcutta Harbor came thousands of tons of supplies for China's troops, who were still grimly battling the enemy in the interminable struggle. Plus the invaluable vehicles so necessary in mobile 20th century warfare. At airfields in India's province of Assam, great quantities of American materiel were loaded aboard transport planes for the most difficult leg of the trip. The flight across the Himalayas came to be known in the CBI as flying the hump. Crossing the top of the world was a stirring experience for the airmen assigned to the run. The trip never became routine. The hump had to be cleared at more than 18,000 feet, and there were no possible spots for emergency landings below. Across the formidable mountains lay the plains of China. The airfield at Kunming was the eastern terminus of the hump run. The Chinese gratefully welcomed the weapons and supplies which would enable them to continue the long, desperate struggle against the invaders. But getting that equipment to the Chinese troops was far from an easy job. Transportation in the interior of China was still a primitive operation. The last leg of the trip was achieved by the most ancient methods, at a painfully slow rate of progress. Chiang's forces continued to fall back under the weight of fresh enemy attacks. The Chinese situation from a military standpoint was growing steadily worse. And with every Chinese defeat, thousands of civilian Chinese straggled back from the area seized by the enemy. Headquarters of the Chinese government had been moved to Chongqing as long ago as November 1937. Here, more than 1,000 miles inland, Free China dug in, determined to fight the enemy to the last. Air raid shelters were built out of the solid rock. The inhabitants of Chongqing grew accustomed to sudden raids by enemy planes. China's new capital was a high-priority target for Japanese bombers. As soon as the enemy planes were spotted far out of town, the alarm would be turned in without a moment's delay. Chongqing was bombed with increasing frequency as the enemy gained ground in China. For the Chinese, 1943 was a most critical year in the long war against the Nipponese invaders. Chongqing was also a nerve center for the Chinese communists, who early in the war had agreed to cooperate with the nationalists in the fight against the common enemy. But in practice, the communists rarely cooperated with the Chinese nationalists. Throughout World War II, the nationalists were forced to cope with two enemies. The plight of the Chinese nationalist forces and the Chinese government grew more desperate. Politically as well as militarily, Free China was being backed into a corner. At the Quadrant Conference of Allied Powers in Quebec, the critical problems of Eastern and Southeastern Asia were explored in some detail. It was felt that the confusion of Allied commands in that theater was contributing to the enemy's successes. To help simplify the tangled situation, the Southeast Asia Command was created, to be headed by Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. The new commander took over his post with a great feeling of optimism.
I feel very honored to have been appointed to the Southeast Asia Command. As you know, it is an Allied command, and I'm particularly proud to think that there will be United States forces and British forces fighting side by side in the Southeast Asia Command with our Chinese allies until we've finally thrown the Japs out and final victory is won.
China's Generalissimo, unfortunately, did not agree on the conduct of the war with Lord Mountbatten, nor with his deputy, U.S. General Joe Stilwell. But on lower levels, the mixture of Allied forces worked more smoothly. Chinese troops were instructed in the techniques of modern warfare by American soldiers. The Chinese were quick to respond to the American training. From airfields in Chinese territory, U.S. planes of the 14th Air Force flew countless missions against the enemy, which was pressing the attack against the Chinese. The steady many day-by-day operations of the 14th Air Force against the enemy in China helped materially to keep free China in the battle during those dark years. In Burma in late 1943, Allied troops were set to embark on the road back to eventual final victory. In late December, at a small clearing in northern Burma, General Vinegar Joe Stilwell returned to lead the forces back to the territory from which he had retreated a year and a half earlier. In this drive, Stilwell had under his command 2 American-trained Chinese divisions, the 22nd and the 38th. The campaign to take Myitkyina was waged by a force of men fighting against overpowering odds. The Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army at the time, General George Marshall, summed it up in his war reports.
The mission that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had given General Stilwell in Asia was one of the most difficult of the war. He was out at the end of the thinnest supply line of all. He could have only what was left. He had a most difficult physical problem of great distances, almost impassable terrain, widespread disease, and unfavorable climate. He faced an extremely difficult political problem, and his purely military problem of opposing large numbers of enemy with few resources was unmatched in any theater.
In his drive back, General Stilwell was accompanied by another celebrated figure, one of the small force of men who had made the memorable retreat, Dr. Gordon Seagrave, the famed Burma surgeon. During 1943, work was rushed on an overland route from India to a junction with the Burma Road. This ambitious construction project was a corollary of Stilwell's Burma campaign. When completed, the Lido Road would give the Allies a valuable supply artery between India and Burma. The road builders followed closely behind the fighting men. In the construction of the road, American ingenuity was supplemented by time-tested Asian methods. The results were gratifying to everyone connected with the project. But all this effort on the part of more than 20,000 engineers and laborers was to prove eminently worthwhile, for the flow of desperately needed supplies for the Chinese troops could be increased. The enemy still held much of the area through which the road would pass. From Lido in India, the route would wind across the rugged terrain to Myitkyina in northern Burma, and then to a junction with the Burma Road, thus effecting a continuous highway from India to China. Behind the enemy's lines, U.S. General Frank Merrill and a band of 3,000 officers and men who called themselves Merrill's Marauders played a leading role in the fight to gain control of Myitkyina Airfield. Since the Marauders were usually isolated, they were supplied by airdrops of food and munitions. This system of supply, on which the success of the Marauders depended, demanded a close liaison between air crews and the raiders. In their perilous operations, Merrill's men suffered heavy casualties. Using the same tactics employed to good advantage in Burma a year earlier by Wingate's raiders, the Marauders fought 5 major and 30 minor engagements against a stronger enemy force and achieved their objective. Gliders were employed to ferry some of the fighting engineers to Myitkyina Airfield. To many veterans of the theater, the struggle for Myitkyina Airfield signified the turning of the tide in Burma. The engineers arrived at Myitkyina Airfield soon after it passed into Allied hands in mid-May 1944. In fact, the airfield had just been seized from the enemy when work was begun on repairing the strip. The only all-weather strip in northern Burma, Myitkyina Airfield was vital to the success of the Allied campaign in that country. On the day after the strip was captured, General Stilwell arrived to pay his respects to General Merrill, whose marauders had succeeded in their difficult assignment. From Michina Airfield, bombing runs could be undertaken against enemy forces in the fight for the territory surrounding the town of Michina. On the ground, forward observers called for more air support. Just as important as the pressing military needs in the CBI were the diplomatic considerations. In an effort to keep peace among the Allied forces in the Orient, the U.S. sent several emissaries to Chungking, among them Vice President Henry Wallace. Mr. Wallace recommended to Washington that China be separated from the command of Zhang's bitter opponent, U.S. General Stilwell, a proposal seconded by the Generalissimo. But U.S. policy in China in 1944 was as variable as the spring breezes which played among the reeds. China's Generalissimo was often toasted one day and scorned the next. In the late summer and early fall of that year, the Chinese were forced to fall back again. Guilin and other cities in southeastern China were abandoned to the enemy. The hapless Chinese were the victims of a determined enemy offensive. Only in China was the Allied position so weak that the enemy could still seize territory in considerable quantity. At Guilin and at Liuzhou, the U.S. 14th Air Force bases were in danger of being overrun and had to be abandoned. Before the American airmen pulled out, they took great pains to be certain that the enemy would not get much use out of the installations in the field. Bombs were set at strategic points on the airstrips. The major air bases at Guilin and Liuzhou were evacuated in the autumn of 1944. The enemy gained possession of an area which included a total of 8 forward U.S. air bases, but not in very usable condition. All over the world, the Allies were driving the enemy back. But in China, the Allied position was steadily deteriorating. In Chongqing, U.S. General Albert Wedemeyer replaced recently recalled General Stilwell as Zhang's Chief of Staff. In late 1944, the Allied military picture grew somewhat brighter. In China and India, the finishing touches were added to air bases which accommodated America's newest and largest bombers. From these bases, it was confidently felt, the enemy's offensives could be effectively dispersed by America's newest air weapon. The new B-29s, operating in the CBI as the 20th Air Force, were capable of covering a range of targets which stretched from Rangoon to Japan itself. In the reconquest of Burma, the superfortresses were used in softening up the enemy's hold on the country's capital and chief port, Rangoon. In one raid on Rangoon, 56 B-29s participated. To the north, Mandalay was under attack by Allied planes and British ground forces for more than 2 months. The Southeast Asia commander, Lord Mountbatten, inspected Mandalay soon after its capture by British forces. Meanwhile, in lower Burma, between Mandalay and Rangoon, American bombers attacked enemy military targets for the first time with Azon bombs, directed to their pinpointed objectives by radio control. The results were most successful. The capture of Rangoon was speeded up by an invasion from the air. A force of Gurkha paratroopers jumped in an assault on a strong point which dominated the approach to Rangoon. The operation went off smoothly, but it developed that the air invasion had not been necessary after all. British ground forces entering Rangoon via landings along the coast found that the enemy had abandoned the city. 38 months after Rangoon had been forfeited to the aggressors, Burma's capital was once again in British hands. The reconquest of Burma had required the services of more than 1 million men. But final victory always made the long, bitter campaign seem worthwhile. In the retaking of Burma, a considerable number of British prisoners were liberated. Some had been taken captive by the enemy 3 years before, but throughout their long internment, they never gave up hope. In early 1945, the first truck convoy left from Lido, India, bound for China via the Lido and Burma roads, now linked. This invaluable artery across the rugged mountains helped materially to speed up the flow of supplies to China. But even in full operation, the overland route, christened the Stillwell Road, accounted for only 1/3 as much tonnage as was flown across the hump in the waning months of the war. To facilitate the flow of fuel from India to northern Burma and China, several pipelines were constructed. From India, the fuel was pumped via pipe as far as Kunming, more than 900 miles away. Thus, one more lifeline was established with beleaguered China. In early 1945, the Chinese mounted an offensive and succeeded in forcing the enemy back somewhat in certain areas. But though the Chinese scored limited gains, the Japanese were by no means in retreat throughout China. By the closing months of World War II, the Chinese gained some ground, but also lost much valuable territory. Jiang's forces continued to attack, but even the most optimistic of his allies never felt that the Chinese could win back China. In other parts of the Pacific theater, the Allied situation was brighter. In September 1944, a group of islands in the Carolines was vital to U.S. success in the Western Pacific. From Palau, U.S. planes could launch attacks against the Philippines, preparatory to an invasion. In the Southwest Pacific, New Guinea was the major battlefield, where the Japanese and the Allies were finally to come to grips. Its spine was a rugged mountain range, tapering off into thick jungle. The Japanese were intent on pushing their advance even farther south. From nearby island bases, Japanese planes moved out in the first of a series of raids on the island continent. Control of the air in the equatorial zone off the mainland of Asia had been seized by the Japanese, who were able to fly over most of that territory with little fear of opposition. Japanese pilots ventured with impunity to the shores of Australia itself. The Australian port city of Darwin came under attack by Japanese planes some 50 times during 1942. In those early raids, the enemy had a relatively easy time of it. In late August 1942, Milne Bay at the tip of New Guinea became the newest Japanese invasion target. Seizure of the Milne Bay area was an important step in Japanese plans to gain control of all of New Guinea. But the invasion was not unopposed. Allied planes went to work on the enemy amphibious force. The Milne Bay area was not to be the enemy's for the taking. The Japanese invasion troops gained a slim foothold, but were hit hard by U.S. bombers. American planes concentrated on the enemy's supply centers and badly crippled the Japanese beachhead operation. For several days, the invaders fought for a firm foothold. Finally, the enemy invasion force gave up the battle. For the first time in World War II, a Japanese offensive had been beaten off. The enemy amphibious force returned to its base. Overland in New Guinea, Japanese and Allied troops were separated by the formidable Owen Stanley Mountains. But the Japanese were filtering across that row of jagged ridges. Australian troops, the principal Allied ground forces in New Guinea for some months, were all that stood between the enemy and the rich rubber plantation country surrounding Port Moresby. To the Aussies fell the job of driving the enemy back. The route lay from Port Moresby across the precipitous Owen Stanleys to Boona on the northeast coast. The men who were to fight their way through that hazardous country along the Kokoda Trail were the Diggers, Aussie soldiers of the 7th Division. For 8 grueling weeks, beginning in late September 1942, the 7th Division Aussies drove doggedly across the mountains under conditions which would have stopped many a fighting force. But the Aussies never let down. In spite of the trying conditions, the morale of the fighting men was good, right down to the privates and lance corporals.
Pushing along the Kokoda Trail took some doing. The country was tough, and we even got used to crossing swamps. If we had had the ruddy Japs in the open, we could have mopped them up quicker than you could have said Jack Robinson. But it wasn't that easy in New Guinea. Most of our blokes were in good condition, but fair dinkum, the jungle took it out of a man. There was always something needed doing, even when the Jap wasn't about. Now and then we stopped for a bit of tucker and a quick look at a snapshot of that Sheila in Sydney. And we couldn't let ourselves go to the pack, even though we weren't in very civilized country. But the stops were short. There was always time to push on again, through the jungle and on up the trail. Every time a twig snapped in front of us or behind us, chances were it'd be a Jap. And most of the time, the twigs didn't snap. The Japs knew this kind of country like a book. When we did find them, we'd give them a good doing over. We knew dead to right some Japs wouldn't be bothering us again. Day and night we had to be on the watch. Often New Guinea seemed to be covered with nothing but kunai grass. But sometimes we'd feel we were getting somewhere. We knew there were Japs ahead, and we had an idea there might be some back of us. There was no way of knowing. It was up and up till it seemed we'd soon be in the clouds. If there were any mountains higher than the Owen Stanleys, we didn't want to hear about them. Just when we felt all in, something would happen to buck us up. If that was a supply plane, we couldn't take a ruddy chance on him missing us. But a thin smoke signal in the Owen Stanleys wasn't always easy to spot. In the air, Yank pilots were looking for signals just like ours. We must have been in a good position, and we were pretty lucky, too. At any rate, our signal was spotted by the sharp-eyed Yanks. We didn't know it at the time, but there were Aussies in that plane too. And at the right time, they did an A1 job. The rations usually got to us just when we were running a bit short. Thanks to the Yanks and some of our own blokes too, we wouldn't have to be living off the jungle. There's nothing like running out of grub to set a man to thinking about food. Before those packets hit the ground, we were after them. Talk about manna from heaven. Sometimes, when the Yank pilots couldn't spot any diggers, they'd drop their load into native villages along the trail. The Bungs, that's what we called them, were a little scared at first. When our boys got hit, they were in good hands in a native village. We were well taken care of by the Fuzzy Wuzzies. Most of them never let us down. Nothing like a fancy dinner in Melbourne, perhaps, but a feast, believe me. After climbing the blasted trail, it was heaven to pitch into some bully beef and biscuits. News from home was just what the doctor ordered. Our gear got a bit of trimming up every now and again. Then we'd shove off again, up the sides of the Razorbacks. The top seemed thousands of miles away. Our cobbers, the Bungs, gave us a hand as we got near the ridge. They were as sure-footed as mountain goats and much handier to have around. Up near the top, we had to be especially lively about keeping an eye open for the enemy. We were about due for another scrap. We smelled trouble, so we thought it might be a good plan to have a look-see. And it turned out to be a good idea. Some Japs' numbers were coming up. Our attack on the enemy positions was sometimes an Allied show. Yank planes would give us air support when we needed it to help knock out a strong point. The Yanks poured it on. On the ground, we tackled the job from a different angle. The job was done, but we didn't come through unhurt. Moving our wounded back in that going wasn't easy. We were doubly glad to have the Bungs with us when any of our boys had to be taken out. The men got the most careful handling possible in that country. These wild New Guinea natives were about as gentle when they were carrying our boys as anyone I'd ever seen. Somehow, our New Guinea helpers always managed to get the wounded men back to safety, no matter how tough that job was. At the nearest native village, our casualties would be taken care of tout sweet. Everybody in the village turned out to do what they could, including all the Aussies who happened to be hanging around. From then on, the wounded were in the hands of the doc, who pulled the boys through most times.
In October 1942, U.S. forces pushed along the coast to a point just below Buna. A Lilliput Navy made up of pre-war island coastal ships snaked through the treacherous reefs. The GIs made the rest of the trip in outriggers. The New Guinea natives were most cooperative. The GIs of the 32nd Division made a novel kind of landing and prepared to drive overland to link up with the Aussies and lay siege to Buna. The necessary supplies which would be needed on that drive were expertly unloaded. The campaign to take Buna was an expensive one for the Allies. Unfortunately, the necessary U.S. strength in ground forces was lacking in northeastern New Guinea during November 1942. The U.S. command, encouraged by the Japanese withdrawal at Milne Bay, expected to take Buna almost without opposition. But the GIs who were assigned the task of achieving that seizure were to find the situation quite the opposite. From Port Moresby, the U.S. Air Force reinforced the Allied troops in the Buna area by ferrying soldiers in considerable numbers across the mountains, plus an occasional stowaway. This was the way to cross the Owen Stanley Peaks. In less than an hour, the troops were making a trip which had taken the 7th Division Aussies almost 8 weeks to do on foot. Some 15,000 troops were transported from Port Moresby over the Owen Stanleys to the battle area behind Buna. Thanks to the ferry service provided by the U.S. 5th Air Force, the battle for Buna was soon to change complexion. The jungle didn't slow down these fighting men. At the strips behind Buna, the men and materiel so vital to the Allied effort were unloaded without delay. Some 20,000 troops and great quantities of equipment were moved north by air during 13 weeks. Again, the New Guinea natives were on hand to assist. The Buna campaign was now progressing into a larger scale Allied offensive. On November 20th, Aussies and GIs joined forces and pressed the attack with renewed spirit. For 6 weeks, Allied troops invested Buna. The enemy resisted stubbornly, but finally the Japanese defense of the area surrounding that coastal town collapsed. Allied forces took the Japanese who were still alive prisoner and assumed control of Buna on January 2nd, 1943. The enemy hold on the northeastern coast of New Guinea was loosened. In early 1943, the situation in New Guinea began to get brighter, with the eastern section now in Allied hands. After Buna fell, enemy convoys from Rabaul moved westward, bearing reinforcements for their troops at Lai. Allied planes took the offensive. In early March 1943, Allied pilots took off in quest of a Japanese convoy of some 16 ships. North of Cape Gloucester, New Britain, the pilots spotted their prey. This was the occasion all the Aussie and American pilots in the air over the Bismarck Sea had been praying for. But Allied pilots didn't have the air all to themselves. For 3 days, Allied planes attacked their targets. Not a single Japanese ship escaped undamaged. Allied pilots had a picnic. In the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, U.S. and Australian planes sank 12 enemy ships and effectively put an end to this determined Japanese attempt to strengthen their New Guinea ground forces. In September, Allied amphibious forces moved up the back of New Guinea in an assault on the area surrounding Lai. In another leapfrog operation, typical of the Allied campaign on New Guinea, Aussies of the 9th Division invaded Lae to implement the drive overland of U.S. and Australian troops moving west from Buna. The value of fresh amphibious assaults in an extended campaign on a large island was readily apparent by the time Lae was invaded. Progress was far greater than it would have been if the ground forces had pushed overland through thick jungle against heavy troop concentrations. On the lengthy New Guinea coastline, landings could often be made at points where the enemy was not prepared to resist. Near Lae, the 9th Division Aussies encountered no opposition in the original landing. Once ashore, they drove inland against scattered resistance. The Aussies caught the defenders of Lae off balance. On September 5th, the eastern claw of the Australian pincer thrust at Lae moved quickly forward. The Australian attack group coordinated its drive with a force of American GIs who were fighting a diversionary action to the south. The fight for the Huon Gulf area was no easy operation. From Port Moresby, American paratroops prepared to fly north to reinforce their brothers in arms fighting in that sector. This airborne assault was personally supervised by the Southwest Pacific Theater commander himself. The paratroopers were to help break the back of enemy resistance at Lae. General MacArthur demanded that the objective be seized at once. 1,700 men of the 503rd U.S. Paratroop Infantry Regiment were to make the jump. Parachute landings in combat were comparatively rare in the Pacific, since the terrain was not often conducive to successful jumps. But on September 5th, 1943, the U.S. troopers took off on a large-scale combat operation. On the success of this jump depended in large measure the effective wrapping up of the Lae operation. The men were intent on the job ahead. Scores of C-47s transported the paratroops across the Owen Stanleys, supported by bombers and fighters. In a B-17, General MacArthur had a ringside seat from which to supervise the entire operation. The general grew especially interested as the planes drew near the jump point. As the vital area was reached, the A-20s laid down a smoke screen, which effectively shut off the planes and the paratroopers in the air from the sight of the enemy below. The men prepared for their first combat jump. At 10:22 a.m., the paratroopers went into action. The jump at Nadzab went off as smoothly as it had been planned. The men of the 503rd performed like real veterans. In all, several hundred planes participated in the operation so vital to the success of the Lae campaign. The trip to Earth at precisely the spot planned took the paratroopers exactly 1 minute and 10 seconds. The conversion to infantrymen was a matter of very few minutes. A few of the men took a little longer. The Nadzab jump greatly improved the Allied position. Salamau fell to the Allies 6 days later, and a few days after that, Lae itself was an Allied possession. The enemy had been pretty well cleaned out of the entire area. The Allies had another secure position in their westward course along the northern coast of New Guinea. In the fruitless struggle, the Japanese had fought a desperate delaying action. The Aussies entered Lae itself on September 16th. The enemy had completely evacuated the battered coastal town. In the 12-day engagement, the enemy had lost men and equipment in vain. Allied air power had provided the necessary added punch which helped to hasten the Japanese defeat at Lae. The ground gained on New Guinea by virtue of the victory at Lae was considerable. The Japanese-controlled part of New Guinea was still the larger, but it was shrinking fast. With the Lae-Salamaua Area 1, the Allied troops consolidated their position and prepared for future assaults against other enemy concentrations in New Guinea. The GIs and Aussies who had taken the Lae area in a truly joint operation moved on to extend Allied control on the Huon Peninsula. But for many, there were a few days in which to relax before going back into action. New Guinea wasn't quite up to the standards of real rest areas, but at least the men could take a short breather. From the airstrips near Lae, now in Allied hands, American and Australian planes continued the attack against the enemy without pause. From the new advanced bases, Allied pilots could pound enemy positions in western New Guinea without let-up. The missions against Japanese Army units, supply dumps, and shipping were stepped up during November and December. By the end of 1943, the enemy in New Guinea was finally completely on the defensive. U.S. 5th Air Force bombers carried the fight to the enemy, softening up the areas where new leapfrogging invasions were already planned. Eastward, the Japanese-held island of Bougainville was about to occupy the attention of American Marines. On November 1st, 1943, they invaded that island in force.